The wind howled across the battlements of Castle Black with a keening lament, as though mourning in anticipation of the blood to be shed. The very stones of the fortress seemed to tremble beneath the freezing sky, and the wall loomed behind them all, a glistening monolith of ice lit faintly by the fading light. Tormund Giantsbane stood upon a patch of cracked, wind-swept stone in the courtyard, surrounded by the bodies of men and free folk alike. Snow drifted around his boots, blood scattered in its dusting. The thick tang of iron hung in the cold air. He was breathing heavily, chest expanding as he exhaled puffs of white in the evening chill. His auburn hair, wild and tangled, hung around his face. His thick beard was flecked with frost and blood that was not entirely his own. Before him lay Jon Snow, sprawled on the ground in his black cloak. There had been a moment of hesitation in Tormund's eyes, something akin to sorrow or disbelief at what he had done. But the rage that had overtaken him, and the swirl of dire necessity that had guided his sword, had formed a perfect storm of violence. This was no moment for second thoughts. Jon's cloak was soaked with crimson, a sharp stain spreading across the black wool and seeping into the slush beneath him. Tormund's hand trembled around the hilt of the long sword, breath coming in ragged bursts, as he looked down upon the man who had once been his friend and ally. "Jon?" Tormund rasped, voice as rough as the bark on an ancient pine, though softer than the wind that whipped about him. He remembered the open camaraderie that had once been between them. Shared mead, shared stories around fires, a bond forged on the frozen ground north of the wall. He remembered the grateful glint in Jon's eyes when the free folk had rallied at Hardhome and beyond, when all had seemed lost. Tormund remembered how their mutual respect had been tempered by suspicion and mistrust at first, but eventually grown into something else. But that was past now. Something had twisted the present, and here he was, steel-bared, the taste of betrayal in his mouth, and Jon's life leaking out onto the courtyard. All around them, the Night's Watch men who had survived the scuffle gaped in shock. The free folk, those who followed Tormund or any of their other leaders, stood with weapons drawn, panting and uncertain in their triumph. Some had died in this sudden clash. Some had retreated, some advanced with savage glee. Yet a hush fell now, the hush of a moment so drastic that it swallowed all other sounds. Then came a roar, a raw, keening wail of anguish. Ghost, the great white direwolf, prowled forward, muzzle quivering. There was something half-mad in the beast's red eyes as it lowered its head toward Jon's body. Tormund felt the weight of it all sink into his bones. He did not want to kill the wolf if he did not have to, but any movement from Ghost might be lethal. This was no ordinary animal. For a moment, Tormund locked eyes with the direwolf. He recognized the hot flicker of mourning in those feral eyes. Ghost growled, the sound low and menacing, echoing around the courtyard. But Jon lay there unmoving. The man who was once the Lord Commander, who had tried to do the impossible, unite the Night's Watch and the free folk, looked so small in that instant. Tormund felt an ache in his chest. It was done. The ache was quickly replaced by the knowledge that there was no going back. The night was about to be drenched in blood. For better or worse, the North would see a tide of free folk like never before. It had not started with treachery. Not exactly. Tormund had come to Castle Black, as he had many times before, half seeking Jon's counsel and half prepared to protect his own. War had always loomed between the Boltons, the Lannisters, the undead beyond the wall, but the threat they now faced was the bitter hostility of the Northern Lords. Many of them would never abide the presence of wildlings, no matter what Jon Snow said or did. The message Tormund had received before coming south was dire. His people were starving in the frosted wilderness. Winter was bearing down like a savage beast, promising that only those with walls, shelter, and food enough to see it through the long night would survive. Jon, for all his determination, was faced with an insurmountable challenge. The resources of Castle Black were limited, the hostility of many Black brothers strong. Tensions rose in councils, arguments about how to house and feed the free folk. Anger grew among Tormund's ranks. They were not slaves to the Night's Watch, nor were they beggars to kneel for scraps. They had fought side by side against the undead. They had bled with Jon and the Watch. Were they not allies? Did they not deserve the right to pass unmolested through the gift of land that Jon had promised? But the land was barren, or it was hoarded by the northern lords, whose misgivings cast a dark shadow on any attempt at trust. Whispers reached Tormund. Rumors that if the free folk ventured too far south, Bolton men or Umbers or worse might fall upon them. Some said that while Jon Snow had words of friendship, those who wore the chains of old traditions or cynicism in the Watch simply waited for the right time to cull the wildlings once more. Something snapped that day. A confrontation in the courtyard over rations that quickly spiraled into a confrontation with the Black brothers who had refused to share. It had begun as a shouting match, Tormund demanding that his people be given fair shares, the men of the Watch responding that they barely had enough to feed themselves. Fists were raised. Swords were drawn. In the chaos, Tormund's men, already coiled tight by hunger and frustration, struck. The Black brothers, more disciplined but fewer in number, resisted with lethal force. Jon's voice had tried to cut through the clamor, ordering everyone to stand down. He had stood between the two groups, trying to keep them apart. But Tormund had been caught in the swirl of adrenaline, the memory of all the hardships his people had endured, the memory of nights when children starved, while crows and kneelers behind great walls refused them entry. Something inside Tormund felt betrayed, and in a single heated instant, he roared a challenge that soared above the tumult. Jon Snow had met him with determined eyes, a sense of anguish in them. He had tried to calm Tormund, to reason with him. Tormund had seen pity in that gaze. He had seen sincerity, too, and it made him feel both rage and shame. It was that shame that pushed him past reason, urged him to break the precarious bond and do the unthinkable. Perhaps if he could take Jon's place, or rid the Watch of its single greatest champion, then the free folk could take what they needed. The details of that moment, of how Tormund swung his blade, how Jon's sword rose to meet him, how the ring of steel battered the night's silence, would remain forever burned into Tormund's memory. They had traded only a few strokes. Jon was skilled, but Tormund had a savage determination that night, fueled by raw desperation. And so, blade found flesh. Before Tormund's mind could protest, Jon was down. Now, the courtyard was silent but for the whimper of the wind and the snarls of the direwolf. Tormund stepped back, trembling hands releasing the sword that clattered on the icy ground. Another hush enveloped them. The free folk, some still bearing the scars of a lifetime of struggle, watched their leader in confusion and awe. Those of the Watch who remained alive and conscious looked on with horror. They huddled near the walls of Castle Black, blades in hand, but uncertain whether to charge forward or flee. Many of them had respected Jon, loved him in their own way, though that love was complicated by the divisions within the Watch. But none of that could bring him back from the gory wound in his chest. "Ghost," Tormund murmured, voice thick with guilt. Slowly, Ghost stepped closer to Jon's body, a low rumble of warning at the back of its throat. Men parted as the wolf went, and Tormund steeled himself for the possibility the beast might attack. Yet Ghost only stood there, muzzle brushing against Jon's cheek, and let out a pitiful whine. Tormund saw the men of the Watch behind him, who looked as though they might be preparing for a final rush to kill him, to kill all the free folk. This was the moment it all changed, Tormund thought. This is the break that cannot be mended. If he died now, so be it, but his people would follow. A voice rang out behind him. "They killed the Lord Commander," someone shouted, raw fury in every syllable. Another responded with a ragged cry, "To arms! Avenge him!" Tormund turned, heart hammering as he watched half a dozen Black brothers rush forward, eyes wild. But behind them came wildlings, surging in, battered and desperate. Some carried axes, others crude spears. The Black brothers fought with discipline, though they were fewer in number. Castle Black was not at its full strength. Tormund gave out a yell, and that set it all off again. Steel clashing on steel, war cries and shrieks slicing the freezing air. He did not remember how long the fighting lasted. Minutes? Hours? Time lost all sense. He found himself covered in sweat beneath his heavy furs, breath rasping in the chill as he commanded those who followed him. Free folk from many different clans, joined by nothing so much as their determination not to die beyond the wall, their hatred of kneelers, or their trust in Tormund's rough brand of leadership. At some point, Ed Tollett, Davos Seaworth, and a few others managed to rally a group of black brothers behind the battered gates. But the raw onslaught of the free folk was unstoppable that night. They flooded Castle Black from within, seizing the courtyard. Men barricaded themselves in the common hall or fled to the top of the wall. Screams bounced off the ancient stone. Tormund vaguely saw Ghost fleeing into the gloom, perhaps confused, perhaps despairing. When the dawn finally broke, pale and cold, Tormund stood at the base of the wall, having forced the last pockets of Night's Watchmen into retreat. Dead bodies scattered the ground. The Watchers in black cloaks, the wildlings in patchwork furs. He realized, with a queer sense of detachment, that the Lord Commander's body was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps Ghost had dragged it away, or some loyal Watch brother had stolen away with it in the chaos. Tormund was unsure if he felt gratitude or regret. He only knew that killing Jon had cast him into a new path, one he had never truly wanted. But there was no turning back now. In the dim hours of that dawn, he oversaw the funeral pyres. The free folk did not abide letting their dead lie unburned. Not after Hardhome and the things they had seen there. They built great fires in the courtyard, flames licking at the lightning sky. The stench of burning flesh, both crow and wildling, assaulted the nose. Tormund spoke to his people, telling them that this was the first step to securing their place in the world. If they stayed at Castle Black, they would die or be cornered by southern armies. They had to push south, claim the north for themselves if the northerners refused to share it. Some among them who had warmer hearts or calmer heads wondered if they might parley. But Tormund had tasted the bitterness of betrayal too many times. He remembered the giant 1-1, the cry of thousands lost at Hardhome, the cruelty the Kneelers had shown his people generation after generation. He had tried trusting them once because of Jon Snow. But Jon was gone, and the break in Tormund's soul was too raw to be salved by reason. By mid-morning, Tormund gave the order. They would march south in search of safer lands, in search of the resources to keep them alive through the winter. Castle Black's gates, battered, half-burned, were forced open, and a mass of free folk poured out, accompanied by giants that still lived, by men on stolen horses, by women carrying children, by old ones who shuffled with the last of their strength. They had no illusions. If the lords of the north resisted, they would fight. And so, Tormund Giantsbane, reluctant but hardened by necessity, led his people onto the king's road. Dark rumors preceded them. Word somehow flew ahead. Riders from the last surviving Black brothers, perhaps, or ravens let loose with messages. The scattered Watchers who escaped the carnage fled to warn whoever might listen. The ravens carried dire warnings. Jon Snow is dead. Tormund Giantsbane leads the wildlings south in full force. They have taken Castle Black. The North had never witnessed such a thing. A complete occupation of the stronghold by the free folk, now surging beyond the wall with righteous fury. Tormund felt heavy in his heart, but he projected only grim determination to his followers. They needed him strong. He had never wanted to be a king, or so he claimed, but that was the role that fate was thrusting upon him. The life beyond the wall had taught him to adapt or perish. So he set his shoulders and marched with them. Over the next week, the endless columns of the free folk trudged across the snowy terrain. The days grew shorter, the nights cold as death. They hunted what they could, raided small villages for supplies, leaving behind confused and terrified small folk who had never expected to see so many wildlings south of the wall. At first, the small folk could barely muster resistance. Some possessed spears or pitchforks, or the swords inherited from grandfathers. But none of that was enough to hold off a horde of thousands, pressed on by hunger. Tormund, in a flicker of mercy, tried to ensure that his people did not butcher the unarmed. But he could not be everywhere at once. Bitter men and women, savage from years of torment, sometimes took out their hatred on those they saw as Kneelers. At times, Tormund faced the choice of punishing his own for pillaging and murder. But the more blood that was spilled, the clearer it became that they were in a spiral of violence. Far to the south, in Winterfell, Sansa Stark received the grim tidings with a numb shock. She had known that Jon was at Castle Black, had known he was trying to broker peace. The idea that Tormund would kill him seemed beyond comprehension. Sansa recalled Tormund as a rough but seemingly loyal warrior who had looked upon Jon with respect. But the letter that had arrived, carried by a half-frozen raven, held no illusions. It explicitly stated that Jon Snow was slain by Tormund Giantsbane's own hand, and that the wildlings were advancing south in a fury. Some letters claimed the wildlings would tear down every holdfast in the north if they had to. Others rumored that Ghost was prowling the forests, maddened by the loss of his master. No one could say for sure if it was true. Word of Jon's death hit Sansa like a hammer blow. She had spent so much time trying to reunite with him, to salvage something of their family. Now it felt as though the last tether to her brother was severed in an act of savage betrayal. The Lords of the North, those who remained loyal to Winterfell and House Stark, gathered in haste. One after another, their banners arrived, each with their own stories of encountering the growing mass of free folk. Some bannermen, especially those from smaller houses, had no illusions about their vulnerability. They were trembling with outrage and fear, for entire hamlets had been torched and sacked. The wildlings were unstoppable, it seemed, not because they were better armed, but because their numbers were vast, and they were desperate as wolves in a lean winter. With the faint memories of old wars in their minds, the northern lords yearned to respond with steel. Sansa, too, was furious and frightened, but she was no fool. She knew that an all-out war across the north with winter descending could bring only death on a grand scale. Yet her advisors, sworn to House Stark, insisted that the wildlings could not simply be allowed to rampage unchecked. Sansa stood in the great hall of Winterfell, her furs draped around her shoulders, hair pulled back in a loose arrangement. The hall was lit with the flicker of torches, but the cold that seeped through the ancient stones was a reminder that winter was here. With a measured voice, she addressed the assembled lords. "We must defend our lands," she said. "But we must also remember that Jon Snow died trying to protect these people from the horrors beyond the wall. We cannot forget that they, too, face the same winter we do. Is there no path to parley? No arrangement that would keep them from burning our homes?" Her words were met with stony silence at first. Then Lord Manderly, a large man with a booming voice, said, "Lady Stark, your wisdom is generous, but these are not men who will kneel to reason. They have proven it by turning on Jon Snow, one of the few men who ever tried to help them. We must muster our forces. Let the Umbers, the Glovers, the Serwins rally. Let us meet them on the battlefield." A few lords murmured agreement. Others shifted uneasily, mindful that a full-scale confrontation in the heart of winter might lead only to more tragedy. Lady Brienne of Tarth, who still served loyally at Sansa's side, caught her eye. Though Brienne was no great war counselor, she knew well the folly of underestimating a determined foe. She also knew the precarious position of the North after the wars that had ravaged it. "If you fight them, many will die," Brienne said quietly to Sansa when the meeting paused. "Yet, if you do not, they'll overrun your lands. In truth, I am not sure that either choice leads to peace." Sansa closed her eyes, feeling the weight of it pressing down. She could almost hear Jon's voice urging her to find another way. But Jon was gone, his voice silenced by the friend he had trusted the most among the free folk. If Tormund Giantsbane could do this, perhaps there really was no hope for peace. She felt tears sting her eyes, but did not let them fall. This was no time for grief to show its face. She was Lady of Winterfell, the last best hope for her house. She stood tall and declared to those gathered that they would send envoys, attempt to stay the wildlings' advance, but they would also prepare for battle. If Tormund refused to speak, or if any envoy was harmed, the horns of war would echo across the north. Sansa's envoys rode out 2 days later, heading north on roads that soon became thick with blowing snowdrifts. They carried her seal, a white direwolf sigil Stark against a gray field. Their instructions were clear. They would find Tormund Giantsbane, or whoever acted as his right hand, and offer them a parley. They bore no illusions that the wildlings would easily agree, but Sansa wanted to try. She did not trust Tormund's reason, but perhaps cooler heads in his camp might value life over destruction. Meanwhile, Tormund's host continued to surge south. They had split in places, some fanning to the west, others to the east, but the largest column followed Tormund down the King's Road. The main body met almost no serious resistance at first, aside from a few desperate bands of local villagers. But as the days passed, Tormund's outriders came galloping back with news of approaching northern scouts. Word spread that an army was mustering near the last river, a region known for its foreboding woods and harsh winter storms. Tormund cursed. He knew the time for a pitched battle was nearing. If he could, he would have avoided it. But his people were too numerous to hide or slip around the North's defenders, and the promise of farmland, of stocked storehouses, and a place to endure the winter was too tempting a prize to turn away from. Every night as they set camp, Tormund would find a quiet place, stare into the flickering flames of the campfires, and remember Jon Snow. In those silent moments, doubt gnawed at him. He had liked Jon, trusted him. Jon was the only crow he had ever truly called friend, and he had taken that friend's life. The image of Jon lying at his feet was as vivid as a fresh wound. Tormund rubbed at his brow, turning his mind away from regret. He told himself that Jon, for all his talk, could not deliver what the free folk needed most: freedom, land, and safety. So if this was to be the cost, if betrayal was the price of survival, Tormund would shoulder it. But it did not make his nights any less haunted by the thought of Ghost's baleful eyes. On the 10th day of their march south, a small party was sighted on the road ahead, a handful of riders carrying the Stark banner. Tormund ordered his warriors to halt. He rode forward, flanked by a dozen of his toughest men and women, each eyeing the approaching northerners. The cold was bitter that day. A light snow drifted from the iron-gray sky, settling on the cloaks and furs of the riders. The lead rider, a grizzled man wearing Stark livery, raised a hand in greeting. Tormund scowled. "Hold there," called Tormund. "State your purpose, kneeler." The envoy's horse stamped its hooves nervously, sensing the tension in the air. The envoy cleared his throat, perhaps unsettled by the sheer number of wildlings behind Tormund, but he kept his voice steady. "I come on behalf of Lady Sansa Stark, the Lady of Winterfell, to speak terms with Tormund Giantsbane. We have no wish for unnecessary bloodshed, nor do we forget that Jon Snow, Lady Stark's half-brother, championed your cause. Is there any room for peace?" That last phrase spat a bitter taste in Tormund's mouth. He felt a wave of anger well up, an anger that he recognized was partly self-directed, but it burned all the same. "It was not so long ago," Tormund rumbled, "that your lord spat on the idea of sharing the land. Many of my folk died, were ridiculed, were turned away, forced to scavenge where they could. Now you speak of peace." He snorted, forcing himself to keep control. "Peace did not stop the hunger in the north. Peace will not feed our children. If your Lady of Winterfell truly wants peace, let her deliver wagons of food and let us settle where we will." The envoy nodded, though he looked uncertain. "Lady Stark is willing to find a solution. She is open to discussing lands, supplies, but she cannot allow your people to simply take all. There must be an agreement, and a way to prevent more carnage." Tormund felt the eyes of his own warriors on him. He spat into the snow. "What your lady wants is to save her own from war, but it may be too late for that." Memories of the starving wildlings, the blood spilled at Castle Black, and the betrayal in his own mind overshadowed any compassion. "I will meet with Sansa Stark," he said at last, "if she comes to me, but I'm not riding south to kneel to her. And I do not promise safe passage for any others who stand in our way. We will take what we need." The envoy stiffened. "Lady Stark cannot expose herself to that danger. If you would come to Winterfell under a truce." But Tormund shook his head, cutting him off. "I said what I said. If she wants to talk, she comes to me alone and we'll talk. Or you can prepare your swords for war." The envoy's face paled. He turned his horse around with a curt nod, and his party rode off, back toward Winterfell. Tormund exhaled. He had left no room for negotiation, but such was the path he found himself on. The old Tormund might have tried to see reason, but that Tormund had died the moment his sword pierced Jon Snow. He expected the next move would be an attack from the North's combined armies, or perhaps Sansa Stark might attempt some cunning ruse. But fate proved more unpredictable. They marched 2 more days through snow-swept hills. The wind cut at their cheeks, and the nights were colder than ever. Then one morning, as the camp was stirring awake, the sun hidden behind thick clouds, Tormund's sentries called out a warning. A single rider was approaching from the south. Tormund pulled on his furs and went out to meet whoever had come, sword on his hip, flanked by the same loyal guards. He was expecting a messenger again, or some bold huntsman. Instead, to his shock, he saw a tall figure in the distance, a glimmer of auburn hair. Sansa Stark herself. She wore a heavy cloak, thick fur trimming, and rode a sturdy northern mare. Beside her was Brienne of Tarth, whose imposing height and bearing marked her as a formidable warrior. And behind them, at some distance, a small escort, though they remained well back. Tormund's heart gave a curious lurch. Sansa Stark was no little girl. She was a woman grown, with an unmistakable air of authority, as though the weight of her house and the tragedies she had endured were etched into her posture. She dismounted with dignity, handing the reins to Brienne, who cast a sharp glance at Tormund. The tension in the air could have shattered glass. Tormund stepped closer, uncertain how to greet her. She was, after all, half-sister to the man he had slain. Sansa's voice was calm, but beneath it, Tormund could sense the tremor of rage or fear. "I am Sansa Stark," she said, "Lady of Winterfell and daughter of Eddard Stark. I have come to speak with Tormund Giantsbane and learn why he has done this horrifying thing." Tormund's eyes hardened. "You knew your father better than me," he said, crossing his arms. "But I heard he was an honorable man. Perhaps you also knew your brother was the only crow I ever trusted." Brienne bristled, looking ready to strike, but Sansa lifted a hand to restrain her. "Then why kill him?" she asked, her tone sounding hollow. "You speak of trust, but you took his life." Tormund felt a stab of guilt. He jerked his gaze away, staring at the icy ground. "Jon betrayed our cause by failing to see that the Watch and the North would never truly accept us. He asked us to wait, to starve, to beg for scraps. He meant well," Tormund conceded. "But good intentions don't fill empty bellies. My people were dying, Lady Stark. I did what I had to do." Sansa looked as though she might tear up, but her face remained stony. "You speak as if there was no other choice. Jon Snow gave his life to defend your people, and you repay him with this. My family has bled enough. He was my brother." Tormund shifted his weight. He was," he answered, keeping his tone steadier than he felt. "And I'll mourn him in my own way, but it's done. My people march south. We aim to take what we need or die trying. And if your lords try to stop us, they'll know the price of standing in our way." Brienne's hand closed around the hilt of her sword, but Sansa remained resolute. Her eyes flicked over the ragged mass of wildlings behind Tormund, the half-starved children, the elderly stumbling in the slush, the fierce warriors clutching battered weapons. "Let me offer you a different path," she said slowly, carefully. "Winter is here. None of us will survive if we tear the North apart in a senseless war. I will make a place for you near the gift lands that were meant to provide for the Night's Watch. Storehouses can be opened. If you truly want only to survive, then come under my protection." Tormund scoffed. "Your protection? We have seen what that means for us, time and again. We are never truly welcome in the South. The moment you don't need us, you push us away. My people have had enough of false promises." A flicker of desperation showed in Sansa's eyes. "Let me prove my intentions, then. Let us find a way to honor Jon's dream of unity. He believed in it so fiercely." For a moment, Tormund's defenses faltered. He imagined a life where the free folk were truly integrated into the North, where they had a place, where he didn't need to carry the heavy burden of guilt. But he remembered the lines of corpses at Castle Black. He remembered how easily steel was drawn when scarcity reared its head. My people are done kneeling. We won't be pinned back in the far corners of your land, starved while your lords sit in comfort. If you want us to abide your rules, you must treat us as equals. Sansa hesitated. She drew in a breath that misted the air. I do not command the entire North, she admitted. Though I have influence, other houses have their own will. They will see your presence only as an invasion. If we march an army of free folk into their lands, they will resist you with steel. Tormund's jaw tightened. Then let them come. Our existence isn't up for debate. He realized that these negotiations were going nowhere. Neither could offer what the other needed without a trust that no longer existed. If you are wise, Lady Stark, he growled, you'll rally your own, because we're not stopping. If you can't feed us, if you can't open new lands that can truly sustain us, we'll take them. Sansa's face paled. She clenched her fists at her sides. Jon wanted peace, she whispered. He died believing in it. Tormund's chest felt tight. Aye, he did, he agreed. Then he turned away, signaling the conversation was over. Sansa Stark looked as though she might say more, but Brienne placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her back to the horse. The lady mounted, a swirl of fur and cloak, and cast one last look over her shoulder at Tormund. Her eyes gleamed with a fury and sorrow that cut him deeper than any blade. Then she spurred her mare, heading south, the rest of her escort joining her. After she was gone, Tormund exhaled slowly, glancing at his watchers. They wanted war. He saw it in their hungry eyes, the adrenaline that came from conquering territory they had once been barred from. That night, he gathered his chieftains and clan leaders around a roaring bonfire. They traded stories of small victories, of villages sacked, of storehouses seized. A hush fell as Tormund stood to speak, towering in the flickering orange glow. Listen well, he said, voice resonating. The men of the North rally against us. They'll want to avenge their Lord Commander, to keep us from taking what we need. But I tell you this, if we do not stand united, we'll be driven back, starved out or butchered. There are thousands of us, many more than they expect. We have giants and fierce warriors. We will not cower before them. A ragged cheer rose, faces set with determination. Tormund nodded, sweeping his gaze over them. We march at dawn. We head for the Umber lands. If those lords want to bar us from crossing, we'll show them our might. Once we've taken their holdfasts and stockpiles, we'll press on. Winterfell is the seat of the North. Perhaps in time we will take that seat for our own. That last statement was spoken quietly, but it carried heavily in the ears of those listening. A few men roared in approval, others looked uneasy. Tormund pressed on. We need a place of strength, a place to endure this winter. And if the Northerners will not share it willingly, we'll carve out our share with steel. The next morning, the horde surged onward. Snow flurries drifted across the sky, blanketing the landscape in a dreary whiteness. Scouts reported that the Umbers had indeed mustered men, and were digging in near a frozen river crossing. Tormund prepared his people for a battle. He recalled how the Umbers had once delivered Rickon Stark to Ramsay Bolton. He recalled hearing of their fierce repute. He did not underestimate them. But savage or not, the Umbers were few compared to the free folk, and soon the drumming of war horns echoed through the trees. The clash began with shouts and arrows slicing the gray air. Umber spearmen tried to hold the bank of the river. The wildlings charged with a fury that defied the biting wind. Tormund was at the front, brandishing a massive axe. He bellowed a war cry that was answered by hundreds of voices. The Umbers fought stoutly, but the hunger and desperation of the free folk could not be matched. They overwhelmed the line, pushing men into the frozen waters, hacking them down in the drifting snow. Some Umbers fled on horseback, some surrendered only to be cut down by vengeful wildlings. Tormund found it difficult to restrain the worst impulses of his people, and he was no saint himself, not with the blood of Jon Snow on his hands. If the North wanted war, they would receive it. When the battle ended, the wildlings captured several hundred umbers along with storehouses of grain. Houses in the area were ransacked, the living driven out or forced to submit. Bonfires dotted the riverbank by nightfall, the flickering light revealing the carnage. Bodies half buried in snow, the water near the shore choked with red slush. Tormund walked among the aftermath with heavy steps. Though he was a warrior, though he had lived a life of conflict, it still weighed on him to see how many lives had been ended, how many families shattered. Children of the free folk played in the snow near the corpses, heedless of the horror. They simply stared with weary acceptance. Messengers soon brought word of a large northern force gathering near the ruins of the dread fort. Rumor had it that Sansa Stark was calling upon every loyal house to muster. The Mormonts, the Manderleys, the Serwyns, and others were responding. Even some knights from the Vale who had followed Sansa in the past might be on the move. Tormund felt a pang of trepidation. He could handle a single house like the Umbers, but a unified northern army might present a true danger, especially if the Vale Knights joined. Yet the wildlings now had the advantage of momentum, and their numbers continued to swell as more and more free folk poured through the wall, hearing of Tormund's victory. The ragtag masses left Castle Black half deserted, claiming it was cursed by the blood of the man Tormund killed. But they still came, chasing stories of better lands to the south. Sansa Stark, for her part, moved quickly. She summoned her banners, forging new alliances out of necessity. The White Harbor men under Lord Manderley were the largest contingent. The Glovers too arrived, some bearing grudges from the years they had clashed with wildlings in the distant past. Small houses arrived with a handful of men here, a dozen there, but their combined strength began to matter. She sent ravens to the Vale, entreating them to fulfill their old promise to defend the north. She even sent envoys toward the Riverlands, though not many had the means or will to travel in the dead of winter. Day by day, more men arrived at Winterfell, forging an encampment outside the walls. Frost-covered tents. Fires were lit night and day, creating a haze of smoke. Brienne of Tarth led a portion of the training, drilling these new arrivals in formation, pushing them to remain disciplined despite the biting cold. Within the Great Keep, Sansa paced the corridors that once held her childhood dreams. She felt colder than the wind outside. She had tried to salvage peace, but Tormund's unwavering stance had left her no choice. She had to defend the north from being overrun. Something about his bearing that day had suggested regrets, but it did not matter if regret guided his hand now. He had killed Jon. She felt it like a raw wound in her heart. She recalled how Jon had once said that Tormund had a sense of humor hidden behind that beard, a good heart beneath that rough exterior. But that good heart was now set on a ruthless path of conquest. She dreaded the battles to come. Tormund continued his advance, systematically breaking any pockets of resistance. The Mormonts, known for their fierce Lady Lyanna, had holed up in Bear Island, which the wildlings did not have the means to assail by sea. But the Serwyn lands fell easily, as the small garrison there was outnumbered. Soon word reached Tormund's ears that the main northern host, led by Sansa Stark, had finally marched forth from Winterfell, heading to intercept him near the old castle known as the Dreadfort, once home to the Boltons. Tormund mustered his chieftains, passing along orders to gather their forces for a decisive confrontation. If they could smash the northern host, Winterfell would be next, and with it the seat of power in the north. The battlefield that was chosen had no name. It was a broad plain of hard-packed snow, ringed by stark winter forests. The Dreadfort loomed on a hill in the distance, its walls battered from previous conflicts, but still standing in silent testimony to the North's bloody history. The sky was the color of slate, heavy with the threat of more snow. Tormund's host spilled across the plain in a ragged line. Thousands upon thousands of free folk in all manner of furs, leathers, and scavenged armor. They formed no perfect formations, but the wildness of their spirit crackled in the air like electricity. Giants stood among them, each a towering behemoth with clubs made of twisted wood and stone. Wolves prowled at the edges. Horns sounded a mournful note. Opposite them, the northern forces marshaled, bearing the direwolf banners of House Stark, the Merman of House Manderley, and the sigils of countless lesser houses. The lines were more orderly, shining with steel breastplates and chain mail. Small pockets of knights were present, though many of the men and women wore simpler armor or thick fur over gambesons. The horses snorted plumes of steam in the cold air. In the center, Tormund could make out the taller figure of Brienne of Tarth, helmetless for the moment, with a shining sword in hand. Beside her, Sansa Stark, wrapped in white and gray fur, her red hair a stark dash of color. She was no warrior, but she stood with grim resolve, refusing to hide away. They stared across the icy field at each other. Tormund's breath plumed in front of him. In his hand, he gripped the same sword that had taken Jon's life. He had cast away the older blade in the chaos, but ended up claiming one from the Black Brothers. Now, the memory of that fateful strike weighed upon him. For a moment, Tormund considered riding forward, calling for Sansa to yield. But he knew she would not. This was it. The horns sounded again, a voice of doom that echoed in the hush of the winter air. The battle commenced with a thunderous roar. Arrows flew from both sides, hissing through the sky like furious insects. The north had more archers, better discipline. Wildlings fell in the first volley, their blood painting the snow in red arcs. But the wildlings answered with savage ferocity, hurling spears and charging forward. The lines smashed together, men and women grappling, swords clanging, shields splintering. Giants thundered into the fray, scattering men like leaves, though many a giant fell beneath concentrated volleys of arrows and spears. Tormund was in the thick of it, cutting down a knight who tried to run him through with a lance. He roared, blood pounding in his ears, lost in the fury of battle. The hush of guilt that had dogged him for days gave way to the primal rush of survival. He bellowed commands, urging his people onward. The swirl of chaos was almost too great to process, as men died by the dozen, slipping on the icy ground, flailing in the snow. Occasionally, Tormund caught a glimpse of Sansa's banner. She had taken position on a small rise, flanked by guard infantry and Brienne. The tall warrior woman cut down any wildling who came too close, her skill with a sword enough to rival the best in the land. Nearby, a giant toppled, shrieking as a half-dozen northerners stabbed it with spears. Another wave of wildlings poured in from the flank, howling. Wolves lunged at cavalry horses, dragging them down. At intervals, horns blew to rally the lines, but in the swirl of white and red, it was impossible to keep track of more than one's immediate surroundings. The ground turned into a treacherous field of half-frozen corpses, trampled weapons, and churned slush. Hours seemed to pass in a blur. Tormund did not know if it was mere minutes. His arms ached from swinging his sword. His breath came in ragged gasps. Shouts of victory turned to cries of agony in an instant. He stumbled upon a wounded northern soldier, a lad no older than 15, who stared up at him with wide, terror-filled eyes. Tormund hesitated only a heartbeat before moving on, leaving the boy to his fate, spurred by the roars of more conflict ahead. Bit by bit, the disciplined ranks of the north seemed to give ground. The free folks' numbers, combined with the sheer mania of their assault, began to overwhelm the lines. Tormund gritted his teeth and advanced, slashing aside a spearman. A savage grin flickered across his face. They were winning. He roared again, the triumph washing over him. Perhaps soon the gates of Winterfell would be at his mercy. Then, from the flank, a horn sounded, higher pitched, a clarion call. Tormund turned to see a wave of mounted knights pouring onto the field. Banners of the Vale snapped in the wind. They had arrived at last, though Tormund had only half believed the rumors that Sansa could call upon that southern host. They thundered in from the east, lances lowered, smashing into the wildling flank. Tormund's people there tried to form a shield wall, but the cavalry's momentum was too great. Men were thrown aside, trampled beneath hooves. The line buckled. Cursing, Tormund tried to rally some of his more organized warriors to meet the cavalry. But Sansa had timed her strike well. With the Vale Knights chewing into the flank, the northern main force advanced anew, pushing the free folk back. Giants roared, but the knights swarmed around them, peppering them with arrows and spears until they fell, howling their last. Tormund saw the tide shifting. The wildlings' advantage in numbers was offset by the savage force of cavalry and the renewed discipline of the northerners. The melee grew more brutal, both sides slaughtering each other in a swirl of relentless chaos. Tormund found himself cut off, separated from most of his men. A group of northern soldiers charged him, but he fought them off with furious swings, hooking a shield with his axe and yanking the man down, hacking another across the chest. Blood spattered his beard. His arms felt leaden. He was nearly surrounded when he heard a roar from behind him. Some of his men had come to his aid, clearing a path. He spat out a mouthful of blood and carried on, ignoring the searing pain of a slash to his side. Sansa stood near the rear lines, face pale as she watched the slaughter unfold. Part of her wanted to shut her eyes to it all, but she forced herself to remain, if only to show her men that she would not abandon them. It was a horror beyond anything she had ever imagined. She saw men from her own banner torn apart by giants, saw Vale knights crash to the ground under the weight of wildlings with axes. Yet they pressed on, their determination as unyielding as the winter itself. She scanned the battlefield for Tormund Giantsbane, remembering his threat. He was the linchpin of the wildlings' morale. If he fell, the horde might break. She spotted him briefly, a figure wreathed in sweat and blood, bellowing orders, unstoppable in his fury. At length, the day wore toward dusk, though the sky remained a perpetual gray. Both sides were exhausted, battered. Bodies littered the plain. The ranks grew thinner. The horns of the wildlings sounded in disarray, and Tormund realized with alarm that his left flank had collapsed under the combined cavalry charges. If he did not withdraw soon, they would be encircled and slaughtered. With an anguished roar, he sounded the retreat, calling for the free folk to fall back. For a time, the northern forces pursued, cutting down stragglers. But as darkness neared, Sansa's generals halted the pursuit, aware that to press too far into a chaotic rout could lead to ambushes in the forest. So the battle ended with the wildlings forced to abandon the field, leaving behind hundreds, if not thousands, of their dead. The northerners, though victorious, had suffered grievous losses as well, a heartbreak that weighed on Sansa's conscience. Her forces were left to pick through the carnage, gather the wounded, and prepare funeral pyres. Sansa herself gazed upon the bodies, numb. This was the cost. She might have shed tears for Jon anew, for the madness that had led them all here, but in that moment, she could only feel hollow. Tormund, battered and limping, retreated with what remained of his host into the nearby woods. They made crude camps and tried to nurse their wounds. A handful of giants remained, groaning in pain, the rest lost on that bloody plain. Many of Tormund's fiercest warriors had fallen as well. Those who survived were grim-faced, uncertain. Some argued that they should flee further south, try to slip past the main roads. Others insisted they should circle around and assault Winterfell directly. Tormund sat by a failing campfire, pressing a rag to the gash in his side, letting out a harsh breath. There was no easy path now. They had lost the advantage. Another defeat like that, and the dream of truly taking the north might die. Even so, when he closed his eyes, all he could see was Jon Snow's face, twisted in betrayal, in those final seconds. He wondered if he was cursed. Perhaps the gods were punishing him for murdering Jon. Perhaps he deserved it. But his people did not. They followed him, expecting salvation, and he was failing them. The next morning, he rose, ignoring his wounds, and conferred with the chieftains. They would make one final push for Winterfell, he declared, before winter's full fury locked them out. Either they would take it or they would break themselves on its walls. If that happened, at least they would die trying rather than starve in the wilderness. The chieftains, though exhausted, rumbled agreement. They had come too far to slink away. It took them days to limp toward Winterfell, moving around the flanks of the northern host. Sansa's scouts were not fooled, though, and soon word reached her that the wildlings were heading for Winterfell itself. She convened her lords. Some urged her to meet Tormund in open battle again, to finish them off. Others suggested fortifying within Winterfell's ancient walls. In the end, she chose to let them come, to force them to assault the castle. The battered knights of the Vale and the remnants of her northern host would defend from the ramparts. She also sent messengers to Bear Island and the White Harbor men, imploring reinforcements. This was it. If they could break Tormund here, the north would be safe for the foreseeable future. By the time Tormund arrived, Winterfell stood resolute against the swirling snow. Its walls rose high, a testament to centuries of Stark rule. Banners flew from the ramparts. The moat lay frozen around the castle, but crossing it would not be simple. Sansa's men had broken the ice in places, creating deadly traps. Archers lined the battlements, braziers lit to warm their stiff fingers. The free folk arrayed themselves in the fields before the castle, battered but unbroken. They carried torches, weapons, the savage hope of those who have burned all other bridges. Smoke from thousands of campfires curled into the twilight sky as Tormund prepared for the siege. He ordered the construction of rams and crude siege towers, though the wildlings were not skilled engineers. They were used to scaling the wall with cunning devices, but that had been Jon Snow's plan. Now they had to rely on brute force. Days stretched into nights. The siege wore on. The wildlings would rush the walls, only to be driven back by arrows and boiling oil. Giants tried to tear down the gates, but were met with a hail of spears. The defenders lost men, but the free folk lost more. For each attempt, Tormund felt the weight of bodies piling up, the futility of it all. Snowstorms blew in from the north. Food grew scarce for both besiegers and defenders. Men died as much from exposure as from steel. Sansa's situation inside Winterfell grew perilous. Her stores were not unlimited, and the presence of so many men depleted them quickly. Both sides needed resolution, but Tormund refused to break off. He stood outside the walls, cursing them, cursing the cold, cursing the memory of Jon Snow that wouldn't leave him be. Finally, a new force arrived. A column of Manderly knights from White Harbor, heavy cavalry with provisions that could keep Winterfell afloat. They swept in behind Tormund's position, quickly erecting their own encampment, effectively surrounding the wildlings on one flank. The free folk were now pinned between the walls of Winterfell and the Manderly host. Tormund might have tried to break through, but his men were too exhausted. Their morale stretched too thin. Each day, more froze or succumbed to wounds. It was a slow strangulation. The final blow came when the gates of Winterfell swung open one snowy morning, and out rode a combined force of northern soldiers, Vale knights, and fresh Manderly cavalry. They struck the wildling encampment from the front while the Manderlys attacked from behind. What followed was more slaughter. The free folk fought with desperate valor, but they were trapped. Tormund swung his sword, cutting down a mounted knight, dragging another from his horse. His vision blurred with tears of rage at the fate that had befallen them. He glimpsed the tower of Winterfell in the distance, recalled how Jon had once yearned to defend that very place. And now Tormund was leading an assault against it, cursed by the memory of a friend he had slain. As the final pockets of free folk resistance were cut down, Tormund found himself face to face with Brienne of Tarth in the swirl of chaos. She towered over him even more than he recalled. In her clear blue eyes he saw no mercy. Steel clashed as they traded blows. Brienne was stronger, fresher, better armored. Tormund was battered, covered in half-frozen blood, half-starved from the siege. He fought as best he could, but each clash of swords sent pain lancing through his body. At last, Brienne's blade knocked aside his guard and slashed across his thigh, sending him to one knee in the churned snow. Panting, Tormund looked up at her, baring his teeth. "Finish it," he growled. But Sansa Stark arrived on horseback before Brienne could strike the killing blow. She dismounted swiftly, stepping through the snow with her cloak swirling around her. Her face was pale as ice, eyes distant. Men all around them, both wildling and northerner, had ceased fighting to watch this moment. Tormund knelt in the snow, wounded, awaiting his fate. He heard the ragged breathing of those left alive. "Lady Stark," Brienne said quietly. "Your orders." Sansa stared at Tormund. There was hatred in her gaze, but also something like pity. Perhaps she recalled how Jon had once called Tormund a friend. Or perhaps she was simply weary of blood. She moved closer, ignoring the half-hearted snarl Tormund gave. She knelt in the snow so their faces were level. "This war has cost us all dearly," she said, voice trembling with emotion. "You took my brother from me. You threatened my home. And now you lie broken in the snow. What more can you hope to accomplish?" Tormund coughed. The taste of blood was in his mouth. "I did what I had to," he rasped. "My people, some of them still live. If you kill me, they might yet find a way. We only wanted to live." Sansa's lip trembled. "I know, but there had to be a better way than this." She looked at him, sorrow flickering across her face. "I should kill you for what you've done, but so much death has fallen on the North. I don't know if I can stomach more. Perhaps I owe it to Jon to end this cycle of vengeance. My father might have said the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword, but these are different times, and my father never faced a war quite like this." She stood, the wind flapping her cloak. Soldiers looked on, uncertain. Tormund watched her with narrowed eyes. "Do it or don't," he spat. "Enough talking." But Sansa surprised him. "You are my prisoner," she declared to the watchers. "For the sake of the North, Tormund Giantsbane will be imprisoned." She looked at Brienne. "Have him bound and taken to the dungeon. Treat his wounds. He will live as Jon would have wished." Tormund wanted to curse her, to fight, but he no longer had the strength. He slumped, chest heaving. Brienne gave orders, and northern soldiers approached warily, binding his hands in thick rope. Tormund's vision swam as pain roared through his wounded body. He felt the faint sting of tears in his eyes, remembering how things had once been when the world seemed simpler. And then everything faded into darkness. In the days that followed, the remnants of the free folk who had surrendered or survived were corralled outside Winterfell. Some tried to flee into the wilds, but most were found and brought back. Sansa, exhausted by the war, declared they would not be executed unless they caused trouble. Under guard, they were given meager rations, forced to labor in menial tasks, or else set to survive in designated camps until the winter ended. Many died, though some integrated into the outskirts of northern society, forging a tenuous acceptance. Bitterness lingered on both sides. Tormund Giantsbane languished in a cold cell beneath Winterfell, his injuries healing slowly. He was given just enough food and warmth to keep him alive, but no more. Sometimes he would dream of Jon Snow, of the man's voice urging him to find a path to peace. In those dreams, Tormund might see a better world, where they never turned on each other. Then he would wake to the reality of stone walls and iron bars, the memory of that fateful sword thrust lodged in his mind. Every so often, Sansa visited the dungeons, accompanied by Brienne. She would stand outside Tormund's cell, gaze at him in silence for a while, then leave. Perhaps she sought answers or closure. Perhaps she wondered if she should end his life after all. But something stayed her hand. The Free Folk's invasion was spent, and all that remained was sorrow and regret. The North, battered and bloodied, rebuilt in the heart of winter. Small folk counted their dead. Lords surveyed their shattered lands, cursing Tormund Giantsbane for leading the savage onslaught that had tested their defenses. But in quiet corners, some wondered if the entire tragedy could have been prevented, if Jon Snow's death had not ended the hope of an alliance. The memory of Jon, and of the dream he carried, lingered like a ghost in Winterfell's halls. As for Tormund, in the chill silence of his cell, he stared at the flickering torchlight on the rough stone walls. He rubbed the scar on his side where Brienne's blade had nearly taken his life. The hush pressed in on him like the weight of a mountain. Some nights, he heard the distant howling of winter winds through the cracks in the castle. He wondered if Ghost was still out there, prowling the frozen forests. Did the direwolf sense that Jon was gone? Did he harbor vengeance in his red eyes for the man who had spilled his master's blood? Tormund never saw Ghost again. He never saw Jon Snow again, save in his dreams. The free folk never reclaimed the unity they once had under his leadership. Some roamed the fringes of the north, living off the land or becoming bandits. Others bent the knee to Sansa's rule for the sake of survival. But the unity Jon had envisioned was lost. Instead, the north had been ravaged by war, distrust thick as the falling snow. And so it was that the man called Giantsbane, who had once been a friend to Jon Snow and a champion of the free folk, lived out his days in a frozen prison, haunted by the deed that changed the fate of the north. Whenever he closed his eyes, he saw the moment of impact. Steel sliding into flesh, Jon's black cloak blooming with blood. He felt the weight of the sword in his hand, the fury in his heart, the regret that came after. Outside, winter raged on, and the north endured in its harsh, unyielding way, leaving the memory of a doomed alliance buried under snow and the echoes of war horns long fallen silent. The torchlight in Tormund's cell flickered with every draft that swept through the damp corridors beneath Winterfell. He could feel the chill settling into his bones, a deeper cold than the winds beyond the wall. This one came from a sense of utter defeat. The rough-hewn stone of the dungeon was slick with moisture, and the smell of stale air and ashes clung to his beard and clothes. Though his side was bandaged, and the fever from his wound had subsided, he knew he was not far from crossing into darkness. Every breath came with a twinge of pain. His once mighty body felt weighted by days upon days of confinement. Sometimes, in the half-sleep that claimed him at night, he dreamed he was perched atop the wall again, gazing at endless icy wastelands. At his side stood Jon Snow, black cloak whipping in the wind, eyes as gray as a winter sky. In those dreams, Tormund always tried to speak, to explain himself, to beg forgiveness. Jon would only look at him in silence, a ghost of a smile on his lips, and then vanish as though carried away by the wind. Waking felt like a blade twisting in Tormund's gut, because the truth always rushed back. Jon Snow was gone, by Tormund's own hand. He had chosen this path for his people. Most nights, Tormund tried to quell regret by reminding himself that Jon had simply not grasped how quickly the Night's Watch and the Northerners might turn on the free folk, how dire the wildlings' desperation had been, how the winter's chill had devoured so many of them in the camps north of the wall. But each time he recited those excuses in his mind, the memory of Jon's open, pained expression as the blade sank home would strike him like an avalanche. It felt more and more like a personal betrayal than some act of grim necessity. In the first week of his captivity, Tormund's wounded leg had left him barely able to stand. The dungeon's guards, stern men wearing stark colors, would come once a day, opening the iron door just wide enough to toss him a waterskin, some stale bread, and a bit of salt fish. They would say nothing and avoid his eyes. Tormund learned to interpret the slight shift in torchlight outside his cell as their arrival. Now, though his leg was stronger, the routine remained the same. Stale provisions, no conversation, a hasty locking of the door. They left him to his silence, as if an entire war could be locked away with one man. On a dark evening when the wind outside moaned like a dire wolf, Sansa Stark came again to see him. Tormund was never told beforehand that she was coming, but he could sense the hush in the corridor. This time, he heard her measured footsteps, the softer echo of Brienne of Tarth walking behind her. A faint light bloomed as they came near. Sansa paused outside the thick iron bars and regarded Tormund with a guarded expression. He tried to straighten, ignoring the ache in his side, summoning that old defiance that once came so naturally to him. But the weight of everything crushed his spirit. Instead, he turned his face away, as if staring at the damp stones was more appealing than meeting her gaze. For a moment, neither spoke. It was Sansa who broke the silence. "Has your wound healed?" she asked quietly. Tormund let out a low grunt. "It's closed. Don't mean I'm well." He braced a calloused palm against the wall and rose, shifting his weight to his good leg. With another grunt, he forced himself to look her in the eye. "What's it, Em? Adder to you, Lady Stark? Planning to finally string me up?" She wore a cloak of pale gray fur, and her hair was arranged in a single loose braid that fell over her shoulder. Her features were composed, But Tormund had spent enough time among the living to recognize sorrow in a person's eyes. He saw it in her. Not just sorrow for Jon, but for the devastation left in the north after the wildling invasion. "If I'd wanted you executed," she said, "I would have given the order on the battlefield. You know that." There was no boast in her tone, only a fact. Tormund said, rasping. "You let me live. I've wondered why every day since. Maybe you wanted me to rot down here." Sansa cast a glance at Brienne, who stood silently by the corridor's curve, her sword at her hip, watchful as ever. "I wanted to end the bloodshed," Sansa said. "I'm not sure my father would have done the same. But we've all changed. We've all had to." Tormund studied her in the torchlight. He could not help remembering her as a fleeting figure in Jon's retelling. "My sister Sansa has returned," Jon had once said, sounding almost like a boy in his excitement. That memory twisted Tormund's heart. "Jon said you were his sister," Tormund murmured. "Said you'd been through a world of trouble." He paused, swallowing a knot of shame. "He was proud you survived it all. He loved you." Sansa took a moment to breathe, her face stiffening at the mention of Jon in that tone. "He loved the North," she managed, voice wavering slightly. "And he loved you in his way. That's why none of this makes sense to me. I keep asking myself how it came to this. He wanted to protect your people. He truly believed he could." She lowered her gaze. "And you killed him for it." A flicker of anger flared in Tormund's chest. Anger at himself. Anger at what the North had forced him to become. "Jon told us we'd have a future," Tormund said in a rasp. "But he was only one man. The rest of the crows, the rest of the Northerners, they didn't share his heart. I saw it in their eyes how they looked at us. And my folk were starving, frozen. Hardhome was in ashes. Can you understand that kind of desperation?" She did not answer at first. The silence reverberated. Finally, she sighed. "We live in desperate times. But desperation doesn't justify." Tormund cut her off. "Don't tell me what it justifies, girl," he growled, though he was in no position to threaten. "We all do what we must to survive. My only regret—" He halted, pressing his lips together. The words that emerged felt like they ripped up from his chest. "I regret that Jon's blood is on my hands." Those words hung in the stale air. Sansa's expression flickered from cold to something more complicated. She nodded almost imperceptibly. "I have decisions to make, Tormund Giantsbane," she said, placing her hand on one of the bars. "The North is wounded. Houses are rebuilding from the havoc your people wreaked. And your free folk, those who remain, are scattered. Some died in our camps, lacking shelter. Others pillage and flee. It's chaos. If we want to survive the winter, we need unity. Or at least a break from endless war." Tormund barked out a bitter laugh. "You think the free folk will rally behind me now? They'll say I led them into ruin. Thousands died. We failed to take Winterfell. All we got was a cell for me and misery for them." Sansa lowered her voice, as if trying to keep Brienne from overhearing. "There was talk," she said carefully, "of simply wiping out the remnants. Some of my lords demanded we hunt them down for what they've done. But I remember what Jon told me about the coming threats. The walking dead beyond the wall. If they ever cross into our lands, we'll need every sword. Even wildling swords." Tormund narrowed his eyes. "Jon was right about the dead," he said, gaze drifting to the thin beams of torchlight on the floor. "Me and mine, we've seen them. Hardhome was proof enough. But your precious wall is in tatters now. Castle Black is lost. If those pale devils come south, there's no firm border to stop them." Sansa's lips tightened. "We repaired some sections of the wall after you left, but not enough, I fear. And the Night's Watch is a shadow of what it was. We're vulnerable. Lady Brienne and others have urged me to keep watch for any sign of the dead." She paused, her eyes searching Tormund's. "That's why I keep you alive. If there is any chance we might use your knowledge, your people's knowledge, to help us survive what's coming, I want to have that chance. But I can't simply let you go. My lords would revolt if I freed the man who killed Jon Snow." Tormund's jaw clenched. So I'm to be your caged beast, a wise savage you can consult when death knocks on your gate. She did not bristle at his tone, merely regarded him with that same quiet sadness. I'm not proud of it, she said. This is the best I can do. My father once said the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword, but I'm not my father, and the world isn't the same. So you'll remain here until I decide another course. I can't promise anything more. He wanted to roar at her, to demand she let him go, but what good would that do? He had no illusions. Even if he miraculously escaped, the free folk were shattered. He would not be able to unify them, and the moment he stepped out of line, any northern bowman would put an arrow through his heart. So Tormund kept silent, glaring at the flicker of torchlight on her face. When Sansa realized he had no further reply, she signaled to Brienne. The tall warrior gave Tormund a single, impassive look before following her lady back up the corridor. Their footfalls diminished into silence. Alone again, Tormund sank down against the stone wall, swallowing a groan of pain. He rubbed at the tension in his brow. The world he had known was gone, replaced by stark finality. Still, some ember of Tormund's old fire refused to go out. He was not dead yet, and if the horrors beyond the wall truly came, if ice and darkness swept south, perhaps he would be needed. If only for that small chance at redemption, fighting side by side with the living against the dead. Maybe that would quiet Jon's face in his dreams. Days crept by. Tormund lost track of time. The snows outside likely grew deeper. The castle above him bustled with soldiers, small folk, travelers, but he saw none of it. Occasionally, he would hear muffled echoes, shouts, hurried steps, once a distant horn in the courtyard. He could not guess whether they heralded some new threat or mundane announcements. One morning, or perhaps it was night, time was a dull cycle of gloom. His cell door opened, and a guard gestured silently for him to rise. Tormund stood, ignoring the throb in his leg, and waited. Two more guards stepped forward and clamped iron shackles around his wrists. They led him up the spiral steps. Each step made Tormund's heart pound faster. Had Sansa finally decided to have him hanged? Were they taking him to some hall of judgment? But when they emerged into the upper levels, Tormund found himself escorted not to the Great Hall, but to a smaller chamber near the Maester's turret. It was a plain room, dominated by an old wooden table bearing charts and scrolls. Sansa stood near the table. With her were Brienne of Tarth, Lord Davos Seaworth, wearing a heavy cloak of dark fur and looking weary, and a few northern knights Tormund did not recognize. Sansa inclined her head in acknowledgement when the guards brought Tormund in. He kept his head high, though the shackles weighed him down. She turned to her companions. "You know who this is," she said simply, "and I've told you all why I insist on speaking with him." She took a breath. "Lord Davos, you've traveled with Jon. You remember how he trusted Tormund's counsel." Davos, who had tired lines at the corners of his eyes, nodded reluctantly. "Aye, my lady." Jon believed Tormund had seen more of the horrors beyond the wall than most living men. "I can't deny it." One of the northern knights, a heavy-set man with a blunt face, spat on the floor. "No matter what he's seen, this one's a kinslayer to House Stark. Killed the Lord Commander who fought for him. We should have hanged him long ago." Tormund's lip curled, but Sansa held up a hand. "I've heard that argument many times, sire. This is not about pardoning the man or forgetting what he did. It's about preparing for what might be coming. If we choose to ignore his knowledge, we may pay with our lives." Davos cleared his throat. "We received word from a few Black brothers who survived the massacre at Castle Black. They mention that the dead have stirred in the far north. Rumors of Hardhome fill their letters. More whites, they say. Possibly others are rising from the snows in those abandoned villages." He scratched at his bearded cheek. "It's all secondhand, but it's worrisome. The Watch can hardly spare men to investigate. They're fewer than ever." Tormund felt an icy ripple of dread. Even from within his dungeon, he had suspected that the others might move in the vacuum left by the wildlings' southward migration. If Hardhome was truly stirring with unquiet dead, then the living were in grave danger. He stared at Davos, then at Sansa. "What do you want of me?" Sansa's expression was grim. "We want to know how many White Walkers there might be, whether they're truly amassing, how soon they might reach the upper gift. Jon told me you and he fought side by side at Hardhome, saw the White Hordes. You must have gleaned some knowledge of their strategies, of how they move." Tormund gave a bitter laugh, and the guards twitched as if uncertain whether he was about to lunge. He only shook his head. "You think the dead follow strategies like your knights and lords? They come in a wave unstoppable, led by those pale devils riding their icy horses. They don't tire, they don't starve, they don't freeze. And with each man, woman, or child they kill, their numbers grow." Sansa's face paled. Davos muttered something under his breath. Another of the Northern Knights whispered, "Gods preserve us." "Gods won't do a damned thing," Tormund said bluntly. "We have dragonglass that can kill the White Walkers or Valyrian steel. Fire can stop the Whites. Beyond that, your only hope is holding them off at a choke point. That was the point of the wall. But you see how that turned out." Sansa looked as though she was trying not to think about the wall's battered state. "We have some dragonglass, courtesy of Samwell Tarly's efforts before he left the Watch. There are caches in certain places, though not nearly enough for a grand army. And Valyrian blades are scarce." She turned to Tormund. "If what you say is true, we have little time to unite the North. But we're battered from the war with your people." Her voice trembled slightly. "Can we parley with the Whites? With the White Walkers?" Tormund almost wanted to laugh again at how naive it sounded, but he caught the genuine fear in her eyes. She was younger than she looked, forced into the seat of rule by circumstance, the weight of the North on her shoulders. "No," Tormund answered. "They don't talk. They don't bargain." Silence blanketed the room. Even the belligerent knight pressed his lips together, as though fully realizing the scale of the threat. Davos gently set a hand on the table, his fingers brushing across a crude map of the lands north of Winterfell. "If they march," he said, voice quiet, "we'll need every sword. That includes any of the free folk still alive, whether they're holed up in the woods or skulking near the gift. If they won't come to our banners willingly, we may have to force them. Even then, we'll be outnumbered by an army of the dead." Brienne, who had been silent, spoke at last. "We must also ensure the Southern Lords know of this threat, if they don't already. The realm is fractured. No one has a strong claim to the Iron Throne that all will heed. But if we do nothing, the North may become a graveyard." Her eyes flicked toward Tormund with a hint of reluctant acceptance. "We cannot ignore any advantage, even if it comes from him." Tormund, arms shackled, could not hide the bitterness in his grin. "So, you want me to rally my people to fight alongside you, the same kneelers who crushed us at Winterfell and stuffed me in a dungeon? Good luck with that." Sansa drew in a breath. "I don't expect them to come willingly, but if they understand that the threat is bigger than all of us." She trailed off, seeming to accept the absurdity of hoping the free folk would align themselves again with the people who had so recently slaughtered them. Yet she pressed on. "Jon Snow would have tried. He believed you were better allies than enemies." A pang struck Tormund's chest. Jon's memory overshadowed every conversation. "Jon was different," Tormund muttered. "He had the loyalty of my people because he saved them from Hardhome. I was the one to break that trust." He couldn't entirely keep the regret from his voice. Then he forced himself to look at Sansa, ignoring the sting of shackles. "But if these White Walkers come south, my folk are as doomed as yours. The dead won't spare them just because they don't kneel to a lord. Fighting together might be our only chance." A faint glimmer of hope sparked in Sansa's eyes. "Then will you help us?" It was an impossible question. Tormund was a prisoner, reviled on all sides. Some of his people had joined the savage assault wholeheartedly. Others had simply followed out of desperation. The trust that Jon Snow had built was shattered by Tormund's own blade. But now that same blade might be needed against the dead. He clenched his hands, feeling the cold bite of iron around his wrists. "I can't speak for every clan," he said. "I can't guarantee they'll listen to me. Many blame me for the defeat at Winterfell. Others might prefer to raid and run. But I can try. Davos looked at Sansa, eyebrows raised. She nodded, resolute. We have to try, she agreed. Lord Davos, I want you to organize riders and ravens to the northern houses. See if any are willing to muster at Winterfell. Also see if you can glean support from the Riverlands, though the roads are perilous. Brienne, you'll remain to command the guard. Meanwhile, we need to figure out how to approach the free folk. If Tormund can speak to them, the belligerent knight cut in. He's a prisoner, my lady. You mean to release him? Sansa's jaw tightened. In chains, he'll be of no use, but I'm not fool enough to send him off unsupervised. We'll escort him into the wilderness. If any of his people remain to be swayed, perhaps his words will reach them. If he tries to flee or betray us, I trust Brienne's sword to be swift. Is that understood? The question hung in the air, more an order than a query. A stirring of protest flickered in the knight's gaze, but he didn't speak it out loud. Davos frowned, but then he gave Tormund a long look and said, We'd be fools to leave the free folk out in the cold. Pardon the pun. I'll do my part, my lady. So it was decided that Tormund, the man who had shattered the North's trust, who had murdered Jon Snow and lost the war for the wildlings, would once again walk free, under watchful eyes, to see if he could gather any fragment of unity against the threat of the dead. Sansa dismissed the knights and Davos, leaving only Brienne and 2 guards behind. She turned to Tormund, standing in his shackles. You'll be given furs, a horse, and some supplies, she said, all under guard. In return, you'll guide our small party to the places where the free folk might be hiding, and we'll see if you can convince them to fight. If you so much as try to slip away, Brienne will deal with you. Is that clear? Tormund inclined his head. His heart felt oddly lighter, though he loathed the idea of serving these lords and ladies. But the chance to breathe fresh air again, to feel the wind on his face, and the chance, perhaps, to do something that might quiet Jon's ghost. Clear enough, he said. Sansa studied him for a moment longer. Good, she said softly. Then let us all hope this choice doesn't lead to more bloodshed. If you help the North fight off what's coming, I'll see that your life is spared. That's all I can promise. It was more mercy than he deserved, he thought bitterly. He said nothing, only met her gaze and then watched as she gave the order for his guards to return him to his cell one last time, long enough to ready supplies for the journey. Brienne followed them out, her hand resting on the pommel of her sword as if it were a silent warning that Tormund's slightest misstep would be his last. That night, Tormund dreamed again of Jon Snow. This time, Jon stood on a vast, icy plain beneath swirling gray clouds. The wind whipped at his black cloak, and he stared at Tormund with a sadness that made Tormund's heart ache. Tormund tried to speak, but the words would not come. Then a distant roar sounded, like the grinding of ice. A shape rose in the gloom behind Jon, tall and pale, crowned with horns of frost. An other, its eyes glowed with a cold blue light. Jon turned, sword in hand, but the shape engulfed him. Tormund jolted awake with a gasp, the cell's darkness crowding him. He could still feel the echo of that bone-chilling presence. Morning came in a pallid hush. Tormund was taken from his cell and brought to the courtyard of Winterfell. Snow was packed and crusted on the ground. The sun, weak behind a haze of clouds, lent no warmth. A handful of soldiers in stark livery milled about, loading up provisions on 2 sturdy mules. Brienne stood near a saddled horse, inspecting the buckles. Tormund noticed that she had a second horse, evidently for him. The presence of that animal, the memory of how to ride, rekindled some part of his old vigor. He wore new shackles, but these were longer, connected by a chain around his waist. His wrists were not entirely free, yet he could grip reins well enough if needed. He also wore thick furs, courtesy of the Stark stores. On his feet, they had given him boots lined with wool. It was more comfort than he had known in weeks. Still, the stares from the guards told him that at the first sign of trouble, they would not hesitate to kill him. Sansa arrived, cloaked in dark gray, flanked by Davos. The Lady of Winterfell cast her gaze over the small party. Tormund, Brienne, the half-dozen guards, and 2 pack mules. "Take fewer men," she told Brienne. "I need every sword for Winterfell's defense if anything happens. Keep a close watch on him. You know better than any how dangerous he can be." Brienne nodded. "I'll see it done, my lady." Davos gave Tormund a thin smile. "Gods be good, but if you lead us into a trap, I'll make sure you regret it, wildling." Tormund almost retorted that he had nothing left to lose, but he held his tongue. This entire expedition seemed surreal to him. Once, it was Jon Snow who had bridged the gap between the free folk and the kneelers. Now, Tormund was the murderer and the outcast, pressed into a desperate mission. He locked eyes with Sansa for a moment. She nodded in farewell. Then Brienne helped him mount the horse, passing him the reins as a guard loosened the chain enough to let him hold them. The gates of Winterfell groaned open, revealing the snowy expanse beyond. Tormund breathed in the cold air, trying to banish the memory of stumbling half-dead on this very courtyard after the siege. The wind stung at his cheeks, but it felt more alive than any breath in that dungeon. With a click of her tongue, Brienne urged her horse forward. Tormund followed, the chain around his waist rattling softly, the guards behind him. The party rode out into a world blanketed by white, the sky an iron gray overhead. Their first stretch of travel was slow, hampered by the deep snowdrifts across the main roads. All around them lay the scars of the wildling invasion. They passed farmland with burned-out cottages, shattered fences, and farmland that had clearly been stripped of any useful supplies. Ravens cawed from the leafless branches of ash and oak trees. More than once, Tormund saw black shapes in the distance, wolves, or perhaps dogs gone feral, scavenging what remained. Brienne was silent, her posture straight in the saddle. Occasionally, she would glance over at Tormund, as if to assess whether he was a threat or if he might collapse. Tormund ignored her stares. He focused instead on the land, searching for any sign of free folk camps. He knew that some might have taken refuge in old ruins or hidden glens. They feared the Kneelers' vengeance, so they would hide well. The question was whether they would rally under the same man who had failed them so spectacularly. As the day wore on, Brienne finally broke the silence. "You knew him well, didn't you?" she said, not looking at Tormund directly. "Jon Snow." Tormund let out a breath. It felt like a question that carried stones. "As well as anyone. Thought he was half a fool at first. Then I saw him fight at Hardhome. Saw the way he protected my people when he could have let them die. So I came to respect him. Maybe I even called him friend." Brienne's jaw tightened. Her eyes stayed on the snowy path. "He was a good man," she said. "One of the best I've known. And now the North is left with a void that can't be filled, no matter how hard Lady Sansa tries. You realize the damage you've done?" Tormund felt anger surge in his chest, but also shame. He said hoarsely. "Jon was the last man who could have truly united us. What I've done can't be undone, no matter how many times I dream of a different ending." He felt the sting of the wind on his cheeks, the iron weight of the chain around him, and the deeper burden of guilt on his spirit. They rode in silence again, the only sounds the crunch of hooves and the distant moan of wind. Towards dusk, they camped near a copse of pine trees. The guards set up a small ring of tents. Tormund was given one to sleep in, though a guard would remain at the entrance, the chain pinned to an iron stake hammered into the frozen ground. For warmth, he was allowed a single brazier of glowing coals. Before they retired, Brienne stepped into his tent, ducking under the flap. In the flicker of the brazier's light, her face looked carved from pale marble. "I have no illusions," she said quietly. "I know your people might kill us on sight if they see you chained up, or they might kill us if you're free. Either way, it's a risk. But if we do make contact, I expect you to speak on our behalf. We must unify against the threat you yourself described." Tormund leaned back, hearing the chain scrape along the frozen ground. "I'll speak," he said, "but no promises. They might greet me with an arrow or a blade. Some blame me for everything that happened after Castle Black. Brienne's expression did not change. "Then we'll deal with that when it comes. Until then, keep your oath, or I'll keep mine to Lady Stark." Tormund nodded stiffly. He had seen Brienne fight. He doubted he could best her with a chain restricting his movements, even if he were at full strength. And what would be the point? If he fled, he'd die in the winter cold, or by some kneeler's arrow, or at the hands of wildlings who wanted vengeance for the fiasco at Winterfell. No, he was tethered to fate's cruel design. Use what remained of his name and reputation to gather the free folk, so they could face a war with the dead. And perhaps, just perhaps, redeem a fraction of his guilt over Jon. When Brienne left, Tormund stared at the brazier's coals. He remembered countless nights camping with Jon, the flicker of firelight casting dancing shadows as they shared quiet words. So many times he had teased Jon for being too brooding. So many times Jon had teased him back for his wild stories. If only I'd listened to him in the courtyard that day, Tormund thought. If only I'd kept the faith. He closed his eyes and drifted into a restless sleep, where once again the dead walked. In the morning, they resumed their northward route, aiming to skirt the old roads in favor of more hidden trails. Tormund directed them toward a region where the Thens had once roamed, though many Thens had died at Hardhome. He suspected some small band might still linger. The days blurred. Snowstorms forced them to huddle under tarps, the wind howling like a wounded beast. Game was scarce, so they rationed their dried meat carefully. Twice, they spotted distant silhouettes of travelers, but when Brienne signaled them, the figures vanished into the trees. Finally, on a frigid twilight, Tormund led them to the crumbling remains of an old fortress near a frozen lake, a structure that might have predated the time of the kings of winter. The walls were half collapsed, but it offered shelter from the wind. Smoke drifted from inside. "If there are free folk nearby, they might hide in a place like this," Tormund murmured. Brienne nodded and motioned for her guards to approach slowly. They entered the broken courtyard. Stone rubble formed a jagged silhouette. A few pine trees had grown up through cracks in the ancient floor. Tormund's breath plumed in the chill air. He noticed footprints in the snow, along with what looked like the remains of a recent fire. Blackened wood, half buried in white. The guards fanned out, swords drawn, scanning the gloom. Brienne rode at Tormund's side, one hand on her hilt. Dusk's light tinted the sky a pale purple, offering just enough visibility to see shapes moving near the far corner of the courtyard. A low, warning snarl echoed. Tormund immediately recognized it as the sound of hounds. Then a voice barked, "Hold! Who goes there?" Brienne halted her horse. Tormund squinted. He made out silhouettes. 4 or 5 men in ragged furs, at least 2 women, and a handful of large, lean dogs with bristling fur. The men had spears, crude axes. They looked half-starved, sunken-cheeked. One of them stepped forward, spear angled threateningly. "Southrons," he hissed. "You've come to kill us, then?" Tormund realized none of them recognized him immediately, especially with the furs he wore and the chain around his middle. He raised his voice. "It's Tormund Giantsbane. I come in peace for once," he added wryly. The man with the spear narrowed his eyes, confusion warring with anger. A woman hissed, "Giantsbane led us to ruin at Winterfell. I'd sooner carve out his eyes." The dogs began to bark, hackles raised. More figures emerged from the shadows, some brandishing makeshift weapons. At a glance, Tormund counted at least a dozen. Brienne tensed, glancing back at her guards. They tightened their formation. If a fight broke out, steel would triumph over these improvised arms. But Tormund had not brought them here to slaughter more free folk. He cleared his throat. "Listen to me," he called, hoping to project authority even while chained. "We lost the war, I know. Many good folk died. But I've come to warn you of a greater threat. The White Walkers, the dead who rise beyond the wall. We have to band together or we'll all perish." Some of them spat on the ground or sneered. A man with wild, matted hair growled, "And we're to trust your new crow friends? We saw what the crows did at Winterfell. They killed our kin. Our children starved on that battlefield." A flicker of anguish ran through Tormund. He fought to keep his voice strong. "I'm no crow. he said. "But these kneelers know the dead are coming. They asked me to find my people to stand together. We're out of time for grudges." A woman in tattered furs, with a scar across her nose, shouted back, "You speak of grudges? You're the reason we marched on Winterfell in the first place. My sister's bones lie in that frozen field. Why should we listen to you, Tormund Kinslayer?" She raised a skinny arm, pointing at him as if cursing him. Murmurs of agreement rumbled through the group. Kinslayer. The word stung, though he had always considered Jon a friend, not kin. Yet it was apt enough in their eyes. Tormund swallowed thickly, searching for something that might break their hatred. "I know what I did," he said, letting a tremor of raw honesty into his tone. "Nothing will bring back those who died. But if we don't unite now, more will join them. White Walkers don't care whose banners we carried. You've seen whites tear apart men like dogs. Or have you forgotten Hardhome?" Mention of Hardhome made several flinch, as though ghosts of that frozen calamity clung to them. Indeed, Tormund recognized a few faces that might have been among the survivors. The memory of that horror still lingered. An entire fishing village overrun, the newly slain rising from the surf with icy eyes. He took a breath. "We lost Hardhome. We lost the wall. Now we're losing our chance to live. I don't ask you to kneel to Lady Stark. I ask you to stand with the living. Fight the dead. It's that simple." Near the rear, an older man with frost-rimed hair and a missing ear stepped forward, leaning on a spear. "If your words are true, how come you ride with a chain around your belly? Looks like these kneelers got you on a leash." Brienne raised her chin, but Tormund answered before she could. They keep me chained because I killed Jon Snow. That doesn't change the fact that the dead are coming. It only changes how much these Southerners trust me. Which is to say not at all. But they need me. They need us. Without the free folk, the White Walkers will tear the North to pieces." He paused, letting his gaze sweep the crowd. "You can kill me now if you wish, but that won't feed your children or keep them safe when winter's wrath marches on you." They stared at him, uncertain. One of the hounds whimpered, sniffing the icy ground. The tension was as thick as a drawn bowstring. Slowly, the older man lowered his spear. "We'll talk," he said at last, voice gruff. "But your crow friends stay back. Only you come inside. No swords. We'll hear what you have to say." Brienne looked ready to protest, but Tormund muttered to her, "It's the only way. Let me speak to them." She locked eyes with him, clearly weighing the risk. Finally, she nodded. Her guards kept their hands near their sword hilts, but they stepped aside as Tormund dismounted awkwardly, the chain clanking. One of the wildlings, a thick-armed woman with close-shorn hair, approached and yanked Tormund's chain, scowling. "You come with me," she said, glancing warily at Brienne and the guards. Tormund raised his hands in a gesture of peace, allowing himself to be led deeper into the remnants of the fortress. He could only hope they wouldn't kill him on the spot. They guided him through a gap in the walls into what might have once been a great hall. Now it was open to the sky in places, the floor littered with loose stones. A meager fire crackled in a pit at the center. The smell of smoking fish mingled with the scent of damp stone. More wildlings emerged from the gloom. Children huddled at the edges, wide-eyed. Tormund's heart clenched at the sight of them. Their cheeks were hollow, their clothing ragged. These were survivors of a war they never asked for. He stood near the fire, trying to gather his thoughts. The older man with one ear, called Valner, as Tormund recalled from fleeting memory, leaned his spear to the side and crouched by the flames. "We'll hear your piece," Valner said. "Then decide what to do with you." Tormund looked around, feeling the chain tight on his waist. The stares from these people were laced with anger and suspicion. He recognized them as he might recognize distant cousins. Free folk who had once followed the likes of Mance Rayder or the Magnar of then. The old days of unity seemed like a dream, but Tormund was no stranger to forging alliances in the face of doom. He cleared his throat. "We all lost at Winterfell," he began. "I led you there because I believed we'd never be safe while the crows and the kneelers called the shots. but that fight cost thousands of lives. Now the kneelers have turned to me, as if I could wave a hand and bring you back into their fold. I won't lie, they want us to fight alongside them when the others come. They claim to have some bits of dragonglass, some men who know how to kill whites. That's more than we have, scattered as we are. And when the night truly falls, we'll be alone and outnumbered." He let those words sink in. A man with a battered shield said angrily, "Why should we die for them? They'll turn on us again when the war is done." Tormund nodded. "Maybe, but we might die anyway if we don't stand together against the dead. I've seen the whites tear armies to shreds. If we want any chance of seeing another sunrise, we need to face them with as much strength as we can gather. That means, for now, fighting beside the north." Volnir rubbed the scar where his missing ear should be. "And what does that do for us in the end? We become thralls to the Starks, forced to bend the knee and live as their peasants." Tormund gritted his teeth. "No, we stand as free folk. We demand a place in the north if we help defend it. That's what Jon Snow tried to arrange. Lands for us, the gift, wherever we could settle. Now Sansa Stark, his sister, is in charge. She's more cautious, but she knows she needs us. Use that to our advantage. Negotiate for territory, for respect. Better than starving in these ruins." A bitter ripple passed through the group. The short-haired woman muttered, "Like we trust her word after the blood spilled." But a few others, especially those who remembered Hardhome, seemed thoughtful. A stony silence followed, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the faint whimper of a child in the shadows. Volnir finally stood, leaning on his spear. "Suppose we hear you. Suppose we gather what few we can from the hills. Suppose we march with you to face these dead crows you speak of. In the end, if the kneelers betray us, if they try to kill us or cage us, what then?" Tormund lifted his gaze, letting the flames cast strange shadows on his weathered face. "Then we die fighting," he said simply. "But at least we'll have died trying to live free, not cowering as the dead swallow our world. If you want to kill me for what I did at Winterfell, do it. I won't run. But if you want to give your children a chance, come with me." The hush deepened. Volnir glanced at the ragged men and women around him. Some nodded, others looked away. Tormund saw tears in the eyes of one mother who clutched a thin child to her chest. Perhaps she remembered a husband lost in the war, or the horrors of Hardhome. Volnir gave a low grunt and turned back to Tormund. "We'll speak among ourselves," he said. "Stay by the fire. If we decide your words aren't worth piss, we'll take your head." Tormund stood there, arms hanging at his sides, as Volnir beckoned several of the men and women to huddle away from the flames, whispering in urgent tones. Tormund's chain felt heavier than ever. He glanced at the children, at the gaunt faces. In the old days, he might have made a rousing speech or teased them with a tale of giants. Now he could only bow his head. He had lost the right to easy laughter. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, Volnir returned, his spear in hand. Tormund braced himself. "We'll try your plan," Volnir said, voice gruff. "Not because we forgive you, but because we fear the White Walkers more than we hate you. At least for now. If your kneelers betray us, you'll pay the price." Some of the group still looked hostile, but none spoke up in protest. Tormund exhaled slowly. "Thank you," he said, wishing he had a better word than that. "We'll go outside now. The night lady with me, Brienne, wants to see that I'm not dead. I'll ask her to let you come under safe passage so we can talk more." The mention of a night made some flinch with distrust. Volnir grunted. "We'll keep our weapons. We'll not be parted from them, even for a moment." "That's fair," Tormund said. "Just don't start hacking her to bits." Volnir's gaze was unreadable. "Let's go." Tormund turned, the chain rattling against the stones, and led them back out into the courtyard. At first, the sight of a dozen wildlings emerging with weapons raised alarm among Brienne's guards, but Tormund raised a hand. "They've agreed to parley," he called. "Sheathe your swords, or this ends in blood." Brienne, astride her horse, surveyed the newcomers with a stoic expression. Slowly, her men lowered their weapons. A hush fell. Volnir stood at the threshold, eyeing the kneelers. "We'll help you fight the White Walkers," he said, voice carrying. "But we want land and freedom after. We want no kneeler lords claiming we're property or forcing us south in chains." Brienne considered him carefully. "Lady Sansa Stark is no slaver. If you keep the peace and honor your oath to stand with us, you will not be enslaved. I'm sure terms can be negotiated, though that's beyond my authority. I'm here to escort Tormund." She paused, then added, "and to make sure no harm comes to him or to us." Volnir spat in the snow. "We'll see." The tension was thick, but at least the two sides were speaking instead of killing. Tormund let out a weary breath. This was only one small band of free folk, but it was a start. They spent the rest of the evening discussing details. How many wildlings might still roam these lands, which places they might hide, where they might gather if summoned. Tormund advised heading to an old hill fort near the Shivering Forest, a place with some limited shelter. The free folk might be coaxed to that location, from which they could travel to Winterfell together if all went well. Brienne approved the plan in principle. She would send word to Sansa and arrange for supplies. That night, Tormund remained chained in the Kneelers' camp, while the free folk bedded down in the fortress courtyard. Though tension lingered, there were no fights. In the morning, they set out together, a strange alliance indeed. Tormund, astride his horse, chained and flanked by Brienne. Volnir and his ragged band walked behind them, their hounds sniffing at the ground. Brienne's guards kept wary eyes on everyone. Over the next few days, they wound through snowdrifts, crossing half-frozen streams and battered farmland. They encountered more scattered wildlings, 2 men roasting a hare under a pine, a mother and her teenage son building a rough shelter near a rocky outcropping. Word spread quickly among them that Tormund Giantsbane was roaming the land in chains, speaking of White Walkers and alliances with the Kneelers. Reactions ranged from spitting curses to cautious acceptance. Yet each time, Tormund repeated his plea, the same plain speech: "We fight together or die alone." Some laughed in his face. Others threatened to kill Brienne on sight. A few joined, more out of fear of the undead than faith in Tormund. By the time they reached the old hill fort, they had gathered nearly 40 free folk. The fort was little more than a crumbling circle of stone at the crest of a low hill, with enough of a wall remaining to serve as a windbreak. The group made a rough camp, lighting fires within the ancient ruin. Guards posted themselves around the perimeter, half of them wildlings, half of them Brienne's men. The tension was a living thing, always crackling beneath the surface. But no blood was spilled. It was then, as Tormund stood on the hilltop looking out over the snow-swept fields, that he felt a shift in the wind, almost like the land itself was worn. "Ing them." Clouds gathered in the distance, thick and bruised with the promise of a heavy storm. But it was more than that. A sense of uncanny stillness spread across the countryside. Tormund remembered that feeling from Hard Home, that hush that settled before the Whites attacked. He glanced over at Brienne, who noticed his grim expression. "What is it?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," Tormund murmured, "but I've felt it before. The wind changes when the dead draw near." Brienne stiffened. "Are you sure?" "No," Tormund said truthfully, "but best we prepare." He called for Volnir and the others, instructing them to keep double watch that night, to have torches and fire ready. The free folk did so without question, fear showing plainly in their eyes. Brienne's men also armed themselves, carefully ensuring their bows were strung, their swords sharpened. Night fell, and the storm unleashed swirling gusts of snow across the hill. The fires within the stone ring sputtered and glowed. Tormund huddled near one of them, the chain still tight on his waist. He had no illusions that if the Whites appeared, Brienne might unchain him out of trust. But what good was a half-hobbled fighter in the midst of an undead swarm? He scowled at the ground, unsettled by the memory of Hardhome's final horror, the dead rising from the water, shrieking with soulless hunger. Not long before midnight, a lookout cried out. Tormund scrambled to his feet, ignoring the chain's pull, hand instinctively going for a weapon he did not have. The free folk rushed to the walls. Brienne drew her sword and barked orders. Torches and pitch-soaked arrows were hastily readied. The swirling snow made it hard to see, but faint movement appeared at the base of the hill. Someone shouted, "Riders! I see riders!" Tormund's heart thudded. Whites seldom rode except for White Walkers themselves. But then a horn echoed through the darkness. 2 short blasts. That was no White's call. "Hold your fire," Brienne called, raising her gauntlet hand. "Let them approach." Torches high. From the gloom emerged a handful of horsemen bearing the sigil of House Stark on their cloaks. Torches flared in the wind, illuminating their faces. The lead rider dismounted, pulling back a hood to reveal Ser Jaime Lannister, hair streaked with gray, face shadowed with lines of exhaustion. Tormund recognized him from stories, an infamous Kingslayer, a man rumored to have fought alongside the North at times in the war against the dead, depending on which accounts one believed. He had not expected to see Jaime Lannister so far in the North or at all. Jaime's companion was Podrick Payne, who helped him keep the horses steady in the wind. Behind them came a small retinue of Northmen, presumably outriders from Winterfell. Jaime approached cautiously, hands raised to show he meant no harm. "Ser Brienne," he said, lifting his voice over the gale. "My lady, if I can still call you that." Despite the tension, there was a note of warmth in his tone, the barest flicker of relief. Brienne lowered her sword, though her eyes were sharp. "Jaime," she said curtly, "what are you doing here? Did Sansa Stark send you?" He nodded, wind whipping at his cloak. "She did, and I come with urgent news." His gaze drifted over the haggard wildlings, the glaring stares from Valner and the others. Then his eyes settled on Tormund, who stood by the fire, chained. Jaime's expression flickered with recognition. He said nothing about it, turning back to Brienne. "We've received reports from the few Black brothers left at Eastwatch. Something stirs in the far north. They've seen flickers of pale shapes on the shore, more than before. Sansa wants you and Tormund to return to Winterfell at once. She's calling every able body to prepare the defenses." Brienne hesitated, glancing at Tormund. "We've only just begun to gather the free folk. We need them if we're to make a stand." Jaime gave a grim nod. "Then gather them quickly, or bring them with you. Time is short. Scouts say the White Walkers are no mere rumor. They're on the move." The words sent a chill through the camp, worse than the wind's icy bite. Valner spat, cursing in the old tongue. Others drew their cloaks tighter, as if trying to ward off the sense of impending doom. Tormund clenched his fists. He had expected this, but not so soon. Brienne sheathed her sword, trying to collect herself. "We'll leave at first light," she decided. "Jaime, you and your riders can rest here for the night. Valner, Tormund, rally your people. If any more free folk come in the night, tell them we march on Winterfell at dawn." Valner sighed. "So be it," he said, though clearly uneasy. Jaime and the Northmen dismounted, leading the horses within the half-collapsed walls. Some free folk eyed the newcomers with suspicion, but no open hostility broke out, not with the Whites so close at hand. Tormund wondered how many old enemies were being forced together by the cold specter of the others. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and turned to find Jaime Lannister staring at him. "So you're the one who killed Jon Snow," Jaime said, voice quiet. There was no open rancor in his tone, but a kind of weary puzzlement. "A foolish move, from what I've heard." Tormund squared his shoulders, chain rattling. "We all do foolish things. Seems you're no stranger to that yourself, Kingslayer." A faint, humorless smile tugged at the corner of Jaime's mouth. "Touché." He glanced around at the wildlings, at Brienne, at the battered ruin they camped in. "I suppose if this alliance can hold, we might stand a chance. If not, we'll all be Whites by spring." The words were bleak, but he delivered them with the calm acceptance of someone who had seen enough war for a lifetime. Tormund raised his chin. "The free folk won't kneel, but they'll fight for their lives. That's all you need to know." Jaime's expression flicked to the chain at Tormund's waist. "And you?" Tormund's lips curled in a grin that contained no mirth. Me? I've got enough ghosts trailing me. If I can kill a few dead men before I join them, maybe that's something. They said nothing else, for Brienne was calling them to help secure the perimeter against the storm. Tormund limped off to assist in stacking extra stones against the wind, while Jaime went to speak with Volnir about the route back to Winterfell. Amid the whirling snow, the free folk and the knights labored side by side, forging a tenuous truce in the face of encroaching darkness. Dawn came in a wash of bleak light. The storm had lessened, but a thick layer of new snow blanketed the land. Without ceremony, Brienne ordered the group to set forth. Jaime and his riders accompanied them, serving as outriders on the flanks. Tormund's chain remained, though Brienne loosened it enough for him to handle his horse more easily. He silently thanked the gods for that small relief. The wildlings marched on foot for the most part, the dogs trotting with them. They cut a ragged path through the drifts, forging south and west toward Winterfell. As they traveled, they passed more signs of ruin. Lonely homesteads where the inhabitants had fled or died. Once, they found a farmstead with footprints circling the house, scattered bits of clothing, and not a soul in sight, only a broken door stained with a sticky black substance. Whites, one of the free folk muttered. Tormund eyed the dark smears in the snow. It was old blood, but from how many victims it was hard to say. No one wanted to linger. Fear lent speed to their steps. By the time they reached the main road, the party had grown as other free folk joined, until they numbered nearly 100 strong. Tormund could see many of them were malnourished, exhausted, but resolved. The kneelers, too, seemed worn down. Jaime's face was grim under a dusting of frost, and Brienne's eyes flicked warily at every copse of trees. When Winterfell finally came into view, dusk was settling again. The castle's gray walls rose from the white plain like a fortress of stone against the swirling snow. Smoke rose from chimneys, indicating that the fires within burned bright. Tormund recalled the last time he had seen these walls in the middle of a siege. The memory turned his stomach. He glanced at the ragtag band of free folk behind him. Many stared at Winterfell with apprehension, as though expecting the gates to bristle with archers waiting to cut them down. Brienne rode forward, waving her banner. A white field with a blue sigil of the sapphire shield she bore in her personal arms, marking her presence. Another guard carried the Stark banner. The gates groaned open. Inside, the courtyard was bustling with activity. Northerners, Manderly men, a few Vale knights. Tormund even glimpsed the bare sigil of House Mormont on some tabards. Snow-laden tents lined the walls where reinforcements had camped. The arrival of 100 wildlings caused an immediate stir. Soldiers bristled, reaching for weapons. But Sansa Stark was there, stepping out from the Great Hall's entry, flanked by her personal guard and Lord Davos. She took in the sight. Tormund in chains, Brienne and Jaime, and behind them a throng of wary, half-starved free folk. Her face tightened, but she raised a hand for calm. One by one, the wildlings filed in, forming a cluster near the courtyard's center. Sansa approached them, her fur-lined cloak dragging a bit in the snow, her chin held high. Tormund watched as she scanned the crowd, seeing the fear and distrust etched on their faces. Then her gaze found him. "You brought more than I expected," she said, her voice carrying across the courtyard. Tormund dipped his head. "We found them in the wild. There may be more. They're here to fight the dead. If your word holds that they'll be allowed land and freedom after." A chorus of murmurs rippled among the northern soldiers. Sansa took a slow breath. She moved closer, addressing the free folk directly. "I am Sansa Stark, Lady of Winterfell. You have my word that if you fight alongside us against the White Walkers, we will do our best to find you lands in the Gift, or near it. You will not be enslaved or driven back beyond the wall." Volnir, who stood near Tormund, gave a sharp nod, though wariness remained in his eyes. "Then we stand with you," he said, holding up his spear. Several other free folk echoed the gesture, albeit more quietly. Sansa nodded, her lips pressed tight. "We'll have to coordinate your lodging, your weapons, your rations. Lord Davos will see to that." She glanced at Tormund again. He waited, uncertain if she would order him back to the dungeon. He was still chained, after all. At length, Sansa said, "Release him, Brienne. A man can't fight whites while chained." Brienne hesitated only a fraction before she stepped forward, produced a key, and unlocked the iron shackles around Tormund's wrists and waist. They clanked to the ground, leaving bruises on Tormund's skin and a sense of odd lightness in his limbs. Sansa's expression was guarded. Jon believed in second chances. "I hope you won't make a liar of me. You'll stay here. Help us prepare for what's coming." A swirl of emotion nearly choked him. He flexed his wrists, feeling the cold air where iron had chafed his flesh. Part of him wanted to lash out, to scream that this changed nothing about Jon's death. Another part felt a flicker of gratitude. In the end, he spoke simply, "I gave you my word. I'll keep it. The dead are the enemy now." Davos exhaled, stepping forward. "We're hearing more rumors by the day. The White Walkers might reach the Last Hearth soon." The mention of the Last Hearth, seat of House Umber, deep in the north, sent a tremor through the crowd. "We need watchers on the road, barricades, a system to burn the dead before they can rise. If you have men, Lady Stark, we must station them properly." Sansa turned to him. "I'll consult with Lord Glover and Lord Manderley. We'll muster at Winterfell, but we also need outriders to monitor any approach. The Vale Knights can handle some tasks, but we're short on supplies for a siege. We must—" She paused, glancing at Tormund and the Free Folk. "If the Free Folk are willing, they might patrol the northern perimeters. They know the land better than most of us." Valnor exchanged a look with Tormund. Tormund nodded. "We'll do it. No man wants to wait behind walls for the storm to break." Sansa acknowledged that with a solemn incline of her head. "Then we'll see to it that you're armed and fed. I expect discipline. No looting or harassing the small folk." Valnor bristled, but Tormund placed a hand on his shoulder, urging compliance. "We understand." With that, Sansa handed the matter over to Davos, who began directing men to find space for the Free Folk in the courtyard or the abandoned stables. Tormund soon found himself mingling with northerners who tried to distribute boiled leeks and tough bread. It was not a feast, but the starving among them devoured it eagerly. The air smelled of horses, sweat, and cooking fires. He was struck by how different this was from the last time he had stood in Winterfell's courtyard, a place of blood and steel. Now uneasy cooperation reigned. In the following days, Tormund worked to organize the Free Folk into patrols. Some took to the arrangement easily. Others disliked any notion of following orders from kneelers. But the threat of the White Walkers overshadowed old resentments. Tormund tried to lead by example, scouting the roads north of Winterfell with small groups. On those patrols, they found new signs of an encroaching terror. Abandoned farmhouses, footprints in the snow shaped like human feet but made by something far colder, a stiff corpse with blue-tinged skin near a frozen pond. The Whites were close. He brought these reports back to Sansa in the Great Hall, where a map had been laid out across a long table. Brienne, Davos, and Jaime Lannister stood by, along with northern lords like Lady Lyanna Mormont, older now but still fierce in her bearing, and Lord Glover. Sansa listened to each new detail with a pale face. One evening, news arrived by Raven. The Last Hearth had fallen to the dead. The few survivors who escaped carried horrifying tales of whites flooding the halls, devouring men alive. The White Walkers marched south. Sansa read the missive aloud to the assembled lords and Free Folk representatives. A hush of horror consumed the room. No one doubted now that war was upon them. Tormund had expected to feel only fear and anger, but something else stirred, a grim determination. He had been among the first to fight the dead at Hardhome, and many of his people had died there. In the silent heartbreak that gripped the Great Hall, he found himself stepping forward to speak. "We can't wait for them here," he said. "We have to ride out to meet them, slow them, give ourselves time to prepare traps or fire pits. Let them see we'll not cower behind walls." Lord Glover frowned. "We don't have the men for a pitched battle in the open." Tormund nodded. "Then we fight clever. Ambush them in the forests, burn them where we can. The free folk can lead you through the hidden passes, set up vantage points. The knights of the Vale can strike from horseback. We make them bleed whites until their main force staggers. Then, if we must, we fall back to Winterfell for a final stand. Jaime studied the map, gold hand tapping the table thoughtfully. It's not a bad plan, in theory, though these creatures don't bleed as we do. Still, anything that picks them off in smaller groups reduces their numbers. Sansa pressed her lips together. We'll start preparing now. Archers with fire arrows, barrels of pitch placed at strategic points. We have dragonglass from what Samwell Tarly sent us, though not enough for everyone. We'll distribute it to our best fighters. Lady Mormont, arms folded, added, My men will fight, but once the time comes to retreat, we'll not linger and be cut down. I'd sooner burn Winterfell than let it become a nest for the whites if we fail. Sansa's eyes flicked with an unspoken grief. We'll do what we must, she said quietly. Then she looked at Tormund. If the free folk will guide us in these tactics, perhaps we have a chance. Tormund drew in a breath. He felt the eyes of both wildlings and northerners on him. This was exactly what Jon Snow had once dreamed of. A united front, crows and free folk fighting side by side. The memory of that dream made Tormund's heart twist. In a husky voice, he said, We'll guide you. We've fought the dead before. This time, we fight them on our terms. So began the feverish preparations for the looming onslaught. Under Sansa's orders, thousands of men, along with the free folk, constructed barricades along roads north of Winterfell. They felled trees to create tangled obstacles, dug pit traps that could be set aflame, placed caches of pitch in strategic locations. Every archer was drilled to strike whites in the legs or sever limbs, hopefully reducing their mobility. Soldiers practiced using torches and dragonglass daggers, though supplies were short. Tormund led scouting parties, ensuring they avoided detection while the fortifications took shape. Within Winterfell's walls, the castle rang day and night with the clamor of blacksmiths forging arrowheads from dragonglass. Women and older men aided in fletching arrows, while children huddled in the crypts for safety, an ancient tradition in times of war. Sansa oversaw it all with a pale, determined face. Brienne and Jaime sparred with the northern captains, demonstrating fighting techniques for when the whites closed in. Davos managed provisions, rationing every scrap of food to outlast a siege if it came to that. The free folk, though uneasy around so many kneelers, did their part, patrolling the outskirts, hunting game, or taking shifts on the ramparts. As the nights grew longer, rumor after rumor arrived. Entire villages along the King's Road swallowed by the dead, outriders who never returned, glimpses of pale shapes in the woods that vanished when torches drew near. Tormund felt dread coil in his gut. Still, he refused to waver. He had chosen this path, staked what remained of his honor on saving the living. If the North fell, it would not be because he hesitated to fight. One night, close to midnight, Tormund climbed onto the battlements of Winterfell for a moment of quiet. Snow drifted from a charcoal sky. Torches glimmered along the walls, manned by watchful sentries. From up here, he could see the courtyard lit by wavering torchlight, men stirring around braziers, the occasional shape of a giant from the free folk's scattered ranks. Yes, a handful of giants had survived after all, 2 or 3, each battered from the siege but still formidable. They would stand with Tormund when the White Walkers arrived. He leaned on the stone, gazing north. The wind stung his cheeks. Somewhere out there, the White Walkers were coming, unstoppable as the turning of the seasons. A presence at his shoulder made him turn. It was Sansa, wrapped in a heavy cloak, her face etched with fatigue. She had climbed the stairs quietly. "Lady Stark," Tormund said, inclining his head a fraction. She stood beside him, looking into the snowy darkness. "I don't remember a time before all this war," she said softly. "I was a child once, dreaming of songs and gallant knights. Now we face an enemy that can't be reasoned with, can't be swayed. I wonder if all the songs were lies." Tormund watched her, unsure what to say. He had never known the comforts of a Southron childhood. He had only known survival in the harsh lands beyond the wall. "Songs keep hope alive," he said at last. "But hope alone won't kill whites. We fight. That's all we can do." Sansa nodded. She lapsed into silence for a long moment, then said, "You risk your life to help us, Tormund. Why?" He didn't speak for a heartbeat. Then he said, "For my people who have nowhere left to run. For the children who deserve a chance not to starve or be turned into dead things. And for Jon Snow, the man I wronged. At least I can honor the dream he had." He looked away, swallowing hard. "If that counts for anything." Sansa's eyes glimmered in the torchlight. "Jon had faith in you. I never understood it, but I see some of what he saw now. I won't pretend to forgive you, but I want you to know that if we survive this, I'll keep my word. The free folk will have a place." Tormund nodded, feeling an odd, heavy gratitude. "Then let's survive," he said gruffly. They lingered a moment longer, gazing at the snowy plains. The tension between them, once rooted in rage and vengeance, had transformed into something else. An uneasy alliance, forged by necessity and haunted by the memory of Jon. The following dawn brought a shrill horn blast from the northern road. Lookouts shouted, and Tormund rushed to the battlements. He saw silhouettes on the horizon, faint but steadily advancing. Mounted outriders galloped toward Winterfell, frantically waving flags. Beneath the pinkish-gray sky of early morning, Tormund realized the final battle was near at hand. The White Walkers were coming. Chaos ensued as men and women scrambled to their assigned positions. The war plan was simple. Ride out with a vanguard to lure and disrupt the White Horde, funnel them toward the prepared traps, then fall back behind the walls if overwhelmed. Tormund joined the Free Folk contingent at the main gate. Giants stood like sentinels behind them, grunting in low tones. Valnor, grim-faced, gripped his spear. Brienne rode up in full armor, sword at her side, joined by Jaime, who wore battered but serviceable plate. Sansa remained in the castle, coordinating from within, flanked by Davos and Lady Mormont. Within an hour, the Outriders confirmed the worst. The dead were less than a league away, marching inexorably. The living formed ranks outside Winterfell. A hush rippled across the host as all eyes turned north. Snow flurries drifted across the plain, partially obscuring vision. Tormund, mounted on a shaggy horse, clutched a dragonglass axe head affixed to a stout haft. He could sense every muscle in his body coiled. A figure galloped from the front lines, one of the outriders from House Glover, crashing back into their formation, eyes wild. "They're almost here," he shouted. "Thousands of them, more than I've ever seen." Even the bravest hearts quailed at that. Tormund gritted his teeth. Thousands of whites, each a husk of a once-living being, unstoppable without fire or dragonglass. The White Walkers themselves would be among them, tall and silent, cloaked in rime. He felt the memory of Hardhome thunder in his skull. At last, they saw movement on the horizon. A line of shapes in the swirling snow, marching like a black tide across white ground. A low moan drifted on the wind. Whether from the whites or the gusts themselves, it was hard to say. Tormund raised his axe. Brienne, at his side, gave the signal. Trumpets blared. The living charged forth to begin the first part of the plan. Harry the whites, lead them into the fire traps. What followed was a battle that seemed to tear the heavens open. Arrows ignited on braziers soared through the air, arcing down into the creeping horde. The front lines of whites caught fire, thrashing, but more clambered over them. The living cavalry circled around, slicing at the edges, trying to lure the dead onto the buried pitch trenches. Giants roared, swinging massive clubs that sent whites flying in pieces. At Tormund's side, free folk who had once hated the Northerners fought shoulder to shoulder with them. A northern pikeman skewered a white, while a wildling woman hacked at its limbs with a dragonglass knife. The ground quickly became a chaotic churn of mud, snow, and blackened, twitching corpses. But for every white that fell, more pressed in. Tormund tried to keep track of Valnor, but lost him in the swirl. All around, shrieks of fear and death mingled with the clash of steel and the roar of flames. The first wave of whites stumbled into a concealed trench. Brienne, her armor streaked with gore, signaled to an archer line behind them. Fiery arrows rained down, igniting the pitch. A wall of flame erupted, incinerating scores of undead. A brief cheer rose among the living. Tormund coughed in the acrid smoke. But the respite was fleeting. Other parts of the line were collapsing under the onslaught. They had to fall back to the next choke point. Again and again, they tried to hold, to burn the dead in carefully laid traps. Piles of bodies smoldered. A stench of charred flesh hung in the freezing air. Yet the whites seemed endless. Here and there, Tormund glimpsed the silhouette of a white walker. Tall, pale figure astride a dead horse, carrying an icy blade that froze the air around it. Any living fighter who came too close died from the chilling slash of that weapon, rising moments later to join the undead ranks. Tormund cursed, rallying what free folk he could find. He saw a giant tumble under a swarm of whites, bellowing as they tore at its flesh. In fury, Tormund and others tried to hack them away, but the giant fell. The whites rose again, unrelenting. "Fall back," Tormund shouted, voice ragged. He looked for Brienne or Jaime, but the swirl of bodies made it impossible to see more than a few yards. Then, from somewhere in the chaos, Tormund heard a roar, an inhuman shriek that shook him to his core. A white walker was bearing down on him, sword of ice raised. The creature's eyes blazed with azure fire. Tormund spurred his horse, but the beast reared, terrified by the unnatural cold. He lost precious seconds getting control of the mount. By the time he steadied it, the White Walker was nearly upon him. Acting on instinct, Tormund swung his dragonglass axe, aiming for the walker's chest. The being moved with inhuman speed, parrying with a clang that resonated like cracking glaciers. Frost spread along Tormund's weapon haft. His arms shook from the impact. The walker slashed. Tormund twisted desperately, the horse screaming, and the icy blade tore a chunk from the saddle, nearly lopping off Tormund's leg. He tumbled to the ground, rolling in slush. The White Walker advanced, silent and merciless. Tormund rose, ignoring the throbbing pain in his shoulder. He hefted the axe again, but the creature's next strike shattered half the blade into icy shards. The savage cold bit Tormund's exposed flesh. He gasped, half-blinded by swirling snow. Everything slowed. He thought of Jon Snow, of how he had failed him, how he might die here in a war Jon had tried so desperately to unite them for. Then, out of nowhere, another blade, Valyrian steel, flashed through the air, colliding with the walker's sword in a shriek of ice. The White Walker recoiled. Brienne stood there, her sword shimmering with black ripples. Frost clung to her armor, but she bared her teeth in defiance. She struck again. The walker parried, but sparks of frost flew. Tormund staggered aside, clutching the stump of his shattered axe. Brienne pressed the attack, a cry of raw effort tearing from her throat. The walker tried to swing once more, but Valyrian's steel bit home, cleaving it from collar to waist. An unearthly screech filled the air as the White Walker burst into shards of ice, collapsing into glittering fragments on the bloodied snow. Panting, Brienne reached out to Tormund, helping him stand. "We have to fall back," she shouted over the din. "The line is broken." He nodded, trying to swallow the terror that threatened to paralyze him. All around, pockets of living fighters were pulling back to Winterfell. Flames lit the sky, and the moans of the dead reverberated. Tormund helped Brienne dispatch a few stray whites with the remains of his dragonglass weapon. Then they retreated in a stumbling run toward the castle gates. The avalanche of undead followed, unstoppable in their hunger. Within the walls, Sansa and Davos directed the defenders. Archers loosed volley after volley of flaming arrows. Boiling pitch was poured over the ramparts. The courtyards rang with the frantic shuffle of men forming shield walls. Giant braziers lined the walls, providing flame to those who needed it. Tormund and Brienne barely made it inside before the gates slammed shut behind them. The undead hammered at the outer barricades, clawing and shrieking. An unnatural cold began to leach through the stone, as though the White Walkers themselves were sapping the heat from the world. Tormund looked around, seeing so many faces twisted with fear, so many wounded lying on the ground. He thought of the crypts beneath their feet, remembering how wights had once risen from tombs. But hopefully the old wards and the sealed nature of the crypts would prevent any reanimation there. Atop the battlements, Jaime Lannister commanded archers while Lady Mormont rallied a group of spearmen. Tormund descended to join them, wincing every step from bruises and cuts. He found Jaime loosing arrows from a shortbow, flanked by northerners handing him fresh ones. Snow whipped through the air, mingling with ash. The undead were scaling the outer defenses, climbing over bodies to reach the walls. Tormund peered down, horror clawing at his stomach. The courtyard below the gatehouse was a seething mass of wights, pounding with rotting fists or hacking with chipped weapons at the heavy doors. Jaime shouted, "We have to hold them here as long as we can. If the gate falls, we fight in the yard." He spat, launching another arrow tipped with dragonglass. A wight tumbled off the wall, dragging 2 more with it. A figure in the gloom below caught Tormund's eye. Another White Walker, striding calmly through the swarm of wights, lifting an icy spear toward the battlements. Tormund bellowed a warning, but the spear was already hurtling through the air. It smashed into the ramparts, sending stone chips flying. A northern archer was impaled, pinned to the wall like a rag doll. The walker withdrew another spear of shimmering ice, preparing for a second throw. "Down!" Jaime roared. Tormund ducked behind the crenellation a heartbeat before the second spear whistled overhead, embedding itself in the battlement. More and more wights piled up. The walls began to groan under the weight of the assault. For a moment, Tormund thought of running, the old survival instinct from beyond the wall screaming in his mind. But he forced it aside. If Winterfell fell, there would be no place left for his people or anyone. He had made his choice. He grabbed a bow from a fallen soldier, knocked a dragonglass arrow, and aimed at the White Walker below. The shot was clumsy, and the wind battered it aside, missing by a foot. Another soldier tried, but the arrow shattered on the walker's icy armor. Then, from behind Tormund, Brienne stepped up with her own bow, carefully took aim and loosed. Her arrow, tipped with dragonglass, struck true. The walker exploded in a shower of frost. The wights around it toppled momentarily, confusion rippling through their ranks. A fleeting glimmer of hope stirred, but it was drowned out by the thunderous boom as a portion of the gates gave way. Screams rose, and a wave of wights poured into the courtyard. Tormund, Jaime, Brienne, and the others could only watch in horror. The final stand was upon them. Men and women below fought desperately, steel ringing, torches flaring, but the undead flooded in. Among them strode other White Walkers, each carrying that terrible cold. "It's over," a nearby soldier moaned, trembling. Tormund set his jaw. Perhaps it was. But he refused to yield. Not now. Not after everything. He started to clamber down the stairs toward the yard. Brienne joined him. Jaime shouted for men to follow. A knot of determined knights and free folk moved as one, ready to meet death with steel in hand. They reached the courtyard in a rush of swirling snow and flickering torchlight. Bodies lay everywhere, some still twitching. The wights surged forward, howling. Tormund roared and hurled himself at the oncoming tide, hacking with the remains of a dragonglass axe he had scavenged. Each blow cut down a wight. Brienne to his left, Jaime to his right, they formed a wedge, driving into the throng. Sansa stood at the steps of the great hall, flanked by guards, her face white with terror but refusing to abandon her seat of power. Fire illuminated the swirling carnage. Giants battered wights aside, but also fell under their weight. The living formed circles around braziers, trying to keep some flame at the center of the fight. Screeching wights climbed onto shoulders, biting, clawing, only to be dragged off and incinerated. Tormund lost count of his kills. Blood, both red and black, soaked the snow. His arms burned, his breath ragged. He fought for every inch of ground, side by side with kneelers he had once despised, all barriers of birth wiped away by the final struggle for life. Then a hush fell. Tormund turned. The courtyard seemed to freeze in place. The whites halted as one. Silence weighed the air like a death shroud. The Reason stood in the middle of the chaos. A tall, gaunt figure with flesh like white ice, eyes burning blue. It was the Night's King, legend come to life, or so Tormund had heard from rumors beyond the wall. No living soul had truly known his face. But there he was, ancient hatred etched in every line of his pale visage. In his hand, a sword of crystalline ice. Around him, the whites parted like an obedient host. Brienne stepped forward, blade in hand, but the Night's King raised his sword in a gesture that froze the very air. Tormund felt an aching cold surge into his limbs, sapping his strength. The wind died. It was as if the entire world was caught in a breath before doom. Sansa's eyes widened in horror from the steps, Davos supporting her. Jaime tried to move, but the cold pinned him in place. In that paralyzing moment, Tormund thought he saw Jon Snow's face, a memory of all that had been lost. He clenched his jaw, fighting the numbness creeping up his spine. The Night's King lowered his sword, and Tormund knew the signal would send the whites forward to finish them all. But before the king could complete his unspoken command, a horn blast thundered from behind the castle walls, a resonance that seemed to roll through the stones themselves. As if in answer, a brilliant flash of orange light streaked across the sky, trailing sparks. It slammed into the courtyard, erupting in a fury of flame that licked high, scorching whites to ashes. Tormund toppled backward, heat washing over him in a scorching wave. He heard roars that were not human, deeper, mightier. Dragons. Disbelief warred with hope. The Night's King's visage twisted in fury. Another roar tore the air, and Tormund glimpsed a massive shape diving overhead. A dragon, scales reflecting the firelight. Flames spewed from its jaws, incinerating undead in a swath. The courtyard became an inferno of swirling embers. The living fell back, shielding themselves from the dragonfire's searing heat. The whites shrieked and blackened where they stood. Entire ranks turned to ash. Somewhere high above, a second dragon soared, unleashing another torrent of flame that crashed into the undead outside the castle walls. In the fury of that attack, Tormund saw the Night's King vanish into the swirling embers, presumably retreating with whatever White Walkers remained. The whites, now leaderless for the moment, froze or collapsed. A thunderous roar signaled the dragons passing overhead again. Tormund blinked through the soot and embers, half blinded by the sudden onslaught of fire. Around him, men and women coughed, choking on smoke. Gradually, the flames died down enough to see. Dozens of whites had been destroyed, though the courtyard was littered with scorched remains. Tormund spat black phlegm, hauling himself to his feet. Sansa still stood on the steps, Davos at her side, both shaken but alive. Jaime was battered and singed, but conscious. Brienne coughed, half her hair singed, though she still clutched her sword. In the sky, Tormund now recognized the shape of Drogon and Rhaegal, Daenerys Targaryen's dragons. If the rumors were true, they circled overhead, preparing for another strike if needed. Across the courtyard, a figure descended from one of the still flapping beasts. A slender, silver-haired woman clad in warm leathers, flanked by men wearing unsullied armor and northern cloaks. Daenerys Targaryen. On the other dragon, another rider, possibly a member of her retinue, stayed aloft. Tormund stared in awe. He had heard stories but never truly believed them. Sansa, mustering her composure, stepped forward to greet the Dragon Queen. They exchanged words Tormund couldn't hear amid the roar and crackle. But the message was clear. Daenerys had arrived with dragons in the final hour, and for the moment the living still stood. The whites reeled from the devastation wrought by dragonfire, while the White Walkers seemed to have retreated to the darkness beyond Winterfell's walls. No one knew if they would return in greater force, if the Night's King had more terrible powers yet to unleash. For now, Tormund slumped against a scorched wall, breath steaming in the charnel air. Free folk and kneelers alike panted in exhaustion or scrambled to douse lingering fires. Bodies lay everywhere, but it was not a complete rout. They had survived the first night. The dream Jon Snow once had, a unified force of wildlings and northerners, had come to pass, if only in blood and desperation. Tormund closed his eyes, letting the swirl of heat and cold wash over him. He pictured Jon's face in his mind, a silent question about whether this redemption was enough. He had no answer, only the vow to keep fighting until the White Walkers were gone or he lay dead in the snow. Across the courtyard, Daenerys approached Sansa, the two women speaking in hushed, urgent voices. Above, the dragons roared again, defiant against the coming night. Tormund opened his eyes, stubbing away tears that might have formed. This was the shape of the living's last stand. And he, the man who had slain Jon Snow, was now one of its defenders. Whether the gods were mocking him or granting him a sliver of absolution, he couldn't say. All he knew was that the final war was upon them, and there was no turning back. The North would either be the grave of the Whites or the grave of them all. Amid the glow of dragonfire, beneath a storm-laden sky, Tormund Giantsbane gripped his weapon and prepared for the battles yet to come. There in the courtyard of Winterfell, scarred by his betrayal, tempered by loss, he felt Jon's presence guiding him toward one last hope for the realm of the living. And for the first time since that bloody day at Castle Black, Tormund felt a spark of purpose that surpassed even the weight of his sins.